Today on Bloomberg This Weekend, President Trump tells NBC News that Iran is ready for a ceasefire, but he's not ready to make a deal. As we learn the names of the 6 American troops killed in the plane crash in Iraq.
And the White House is calling on other countries to help secure the Strait of Hormuz as oil prices climb. A live report from the Strait, hours after a deadly missile strike sent huge flames and plumes of smoke into the air.
Plus, it's Oscars Sunday, how the show is changing in the era of streaming, and predictions for who will take home the statue.
I tend to think that the Oscar should go to the movie that people will really remember and talk about 5-10 years down the line.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, March 14th, and we are here every weekend from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Wall Street time. Even though the markets are closed, bringing you the latest breaking news, in-depth analysis, and up-to-the-minute news and business headlines from around the world.
Christina, I want to start with news that was breaking overnight. The Pentagon releasing the names of those 6 service members who were killed in that plane crash in Iraq, and read their names now. Captain Seth Koval among them, Captain Curtis Angst, Major John Klinner, Technical Sergeant Tyler Simmons, Technical Sergeant Ashley Pruitt, and Captain Ariana Savino. And we continue to, of course, watch this war widen, Christina, across the region. Geographically, we see the news that the president plans to send a Marine Expeditionary Group to the Middle East now to expand the total number of service members there in the region. He talks about the prospects of this ending soon, but all indications are that's not the case.
Well, and collateral damage, including American casualties, I think are already higher than possibly people anticipated. We're up to at least 13 American casualties, and 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes were reportedly struck at an air base in Saudi. That's at least 7 refueling planes have been hit overall. Obviously, they're slower. They're they're a little bit of a bigger target, but this war is costing America more than just dollars, and we're going to have to see how long the president and the American people want to stay in it.
And I think about this in complement of what we were covering yesterday, that being the attack on the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad, the smoke that we saw rising from that place in the Green Zone yesterday.
And Americans in that country have been ordered to get out.
Yes, yeah. That situation worsening as well. Let's get an update on the headlines now from Lisa Mateo. Lisa.
Continue with the war. President Donald Trump says Iran is ready to negotiate a ceasefire, but he's not ready to make a deal. It was a 30-minute phone interview with NBC News. The president said, quote, terms aren't good enough yet. He did not say what those terms were. Now, Trump also dismissed concerns about rising gas prices and questioned whether Iran's new supreme leader is even alive. At the same time, the president ramping up the pressure on Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, calling on countries to send warships to help commercial vessels pass through safely. In a social media post, the president gave little detail beyond saying that he hoped that China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK would pitch in. In another post, the president added that the U.S. will provide help for those nations which take care of the passage. Iran's foreign minister responded, saying the strait was only shut to ships from, quote, enemies. About 1/5 of the world's oil supplies normally flow through Hormuz. Now, this all comes after President Trump ordered a strike on military sites on Kharg Island, from which Iran exports most of its oil. Now, according to tolls from government and non-governmental organizations, roughly 3,750 people have been killed across the region since the war began on February 28th. Now, speaking from Beirut, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an immediate end to hostilities and a stop to the Israeli bombing in Lebanon and rocket fire by Hezbollah.
We are doing everything we can now to bring about an immediate de-escalation and a cessation of hostilities. My special coordinator is engaging with all actors around the clock to bring the parties to the table.
Now, happening today, U.S. and China trade talks. They are underway in Paris, taking part in negotiations. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, also U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and China's Vice Premier He Lifeng. They're expected to review the latest developments in a truce reached in November, also discuss the war in Iran, as well as investment and purchases. And David and Christina, this all comes ahead of course, President Trump's visit to China that happens later this
Laying the groundwork for that visit. We'll be following that meeting with a special interest over the course of today and tomorrow. Going to go back to Iran now, to the Middle East, that main story. We had President Trump having a phone interview with NBC News exclusively talking about the war, where it stands and where he sees it headed. And he said, quote, Iran wants to make a deal, and I don't want to make it because the terms are not good enough. yet, Christina.
All right, joining us now to discuss all this are Bloomberg's host of Horizon Middle East and Africa, Jumana Bersetchi, the AP's international correspondent, Philip Crowther, who is live near the Strait of Hormuz, and Bloomberg's Washington's deputy bureau chief, Laura Davidson, who is actually in Tokyo. Thank you all so much for joining us. Philip, I want to start with you because there were some pretty dramatic images overnight of smoke rising from a port that I believe is somewhat near you. Iran had said that they believe some of these incoming missiles were fired from the UAE. Was this retribution for that? What has Iran said, and how has the UAE responded?
Yeah, this appears to have been a retribution. This is the Al Fujairah oil facility. It's just a few kilometers south from where we are here. About 24 hours ago, there were two huge black plumes of smoke coming from there. This from two separate apparent drone attacks. Now, these weren't drones that necessarily hit the plant directly, but that might have been shot down. It's called an interception, and that fragments thereof might have hit the oil facility, led to a stop of at least some of the operations there. They appear to be back up and running now. But yes, a retaliation it certainly was. And what Iran has been saying, and has been clearly singling out the United Arab Emirates, where I am now right here, is that they're saying that U.S. attacks on specifically Kharg Island, where, of course, Iran processes a very large percentage of its oil at its terminal, that was attacked by the United States from the United Arab Emirates, from air bases or even from ports. So the reaction from Iran was to say that everybody should evacuate 3 big ports in the United Arab Emirates. And that includes the one we just mentioned, Al Fujairah, also includes the biggest port in the whole of the Middle East. And there was a threat that there were going to be further attacks on those ports, again, because Iran says they were used to stage U.S. attacks on Iran. Iran is saying this without any proof, and indeed the U.S. military hasn't even deemed it worthy of a response. Now, there haven't been any, from the point of view of Iran, we should say, successful attacks on those ports. There might have been some interceptions over the last 24 hours or so, but there have been no direct hits, no fragments of drones or missiles have hit any facilities or anything in the United Arab Emirates over the last 24 hours. And that, in fact, goes for most Gulf countries. There have been mass attacks of drones on Bahrain, for example, on Saudi Arabia as well. But the air defenses of most of these Gulf countries have been working well and increasingly well as this conflict continues.
Jumana, I want to turn to you and go back to that comment from the president to NBC News just about the state of play in this war and where it might be headed. Lingering on that line that Iran wants to make a deal, but the president doesn't think the terms are good enough yet. What is your sense of what the president is hoping for or wants in terms of a deal, and how far apart these two sides are at this juncture in the war?
Well, it's also interesting to observe the evolution of his thinking. It was a couple of days prior, I think he was calling for, once again, the unconditional surrender of the Iranian regime, but now he seems to be open once again to establishing a deal with them of some sorts. In that interview with NBC, he declined to give a lot of commentary on exactly what the conditions would be, but maintained, and this is, a stance that the U.S. has maintained even before the war kicked off, that Iran should never have the ability to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, from Iran's perspective, we've had a couple of notable figures from the regime speak out. We've had the Iranian foreign minister make some remarks, in addition to President Pezeshkian putting up a post a couple of days ago where they suggested their conditions to come to the negotiating table with the U.S. would include, number one, full recognition of Iran's, quote, legitimate rights, without giving a lot of information on what exactly that means. Number two, reparations for damages caused. And then number three, and this is probably the most important element, guarantees that a war like this will never happen again. So they are staking their own terms to go back to the negotiating table. Of course, their economy is massively buckling under the strain even before this war kicked off. And now there's the real threat of civilian infrastructure being targeted as well. Kharg Island, obviously a key lifeblood for them. But I would say from the perspective of the Iranians, we always said from the beginning, this was a fight for their existence. It's an existential fight for them. And the fact that the U.S. are now saying, or no longer talking about regime change, but are saying, okay, we're ready to cut a deal, in their eyes, actually is a victory. And they have sustained a lot of blows. Maybe they're losing militarily, but if they come out of this, the other side, still intact and still effectively leading the country, then they will deem that to be a victory. So I think, there's still a lot of daylight between the two sides. And from the Iranian perspective, they will continue to inflict as many blows as they can, as much economic cost on these Gulf countries and on the global economy in order to somehow bring the U.S. as well closer to what they're asking for.
Laura, I want to go to you now over in Tokyo, because the backdrop of all of this conflict is, of course, what it's doing to the world energy markets, what it's doing to global economies. And at the same time, you have this Trump-Xi summit coming up. And there's a couple things going on. There's U.S.-China talks about to happen, or happening right now in Paris. And then you are in Japan for this. There's economic secretaries there as well. David just wrote down the name of the summit, and I've already forgotten it. So can you please remind me the name of the Tokyo summit, and then just kind of set the stage for us what's going on and where these two big countries are going to go in the backdrop of all this happening in the Middle East?
It's not an easy name.
It's on there somewhere. We'll set it straight.
But yeah, this is a summit. It's largely between the U.S. and Japan, but there's also about 18 countries who are also participating with high-level economic and energy officials from the region to talk basically about critical minerals and energy. That, of course, was important even before Iran. Now, with the backdrop of oil prices spiking, this has really added a lot of urgency and intensity to these discussions. Of course, the deals that have been struck, so far this weekend have been relatively modest in scale. These are longer-term arrangements. These are memorandums of understanding, things that won't really do anything to address the current situation at hand, but really set the stage for this visit. The Prime Minister of Japan, Takaichi, is headed to the White House on Thursday. She has been quite critical of the U.S.'s stance in Iran, has questioned the legality of these strikes, and said she plans to have a very frank and stern conversation with Trump. So this is, we're seeing a lot of posturing from allies in the Indo-Pacific region, looking to get in the good graces of the Trump administration with some of these deals, but looking to take a stronger, firmer stance when it comes to geopolitics.
Our control room tells us it is the Indo-Pacific Energy Security Ministerial and Business Forum. I feel less bad for not having it at the top of my tongue.
Rolls right off the tongue. And we have Lee Zeldin, the EPA Administrator, joining us from those talks here in a few minutes' time, I should say. But of course, nothing is shaping the conversation about global energy more than the Strait that we see behind Philip Crowther. And Philip, I'll go back to you and again reference that interview that was on NBC News conducted with President Trump via telephone. He said, "We're going to be sweeping the Strait very strongly, and we believe we'll be joined by other countries who are somewhat impeded, and in some cases impeded from getting the oil." I'm looking at that line, "we believe," as he invokes China and France and Japan and South Korea and other countries. This is a war that largely has been prosecuted by the U.S. and Israel, just the two of them. Now we have a president talking about the need for allies to reopen or get traffic flowing in that strait once again. Your sense of the willingness of other countries to do that? And I know yesterday we had a conversation just about how little traffic you were able to observe in the strait behind you. Has anything notionally changed here over the last 24 hours?
First of all, it hasn't. There has not been any increasing traffic here because there is no deal, and it is still very much deemed too dangerous for any container ships, one of which we see behind us, but of course more crucially for the world economic markets, for oil tankers and those carrying liquefied natural gas to pass from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz to, well, essentially where I am here, out into the wider world, and bringing those commodities to the international market. Now, back to what you mentioned, though, this has happened before in the Middle East, that the United States has more or less unilaterally gone to war and then in the aftermath is asking for help, essentially. And in this case, what President Trump is doing, he's maybe enticing other countries to get involved in what would boil down to an international coalition of warships to protect these ships going in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Is he enticing them? Is he provoking them into joining him? Is he just basically saying this is a fait accompli? You need to now be part of this because it's your ships that are not getting through. And it is true, of course. These are countries and companies that are very much affected by a US-Israeli war on Iran. And China is number one there because such a huge percentage of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China. So in his post last night by President Trump on his social network, on Truth Social, he was naming countries specifically, not innocently. You know, there was a reason for this. France, the United Kingdom. Of course, that's understandable. These are Western allies, but also Japan, South Korea, and specifically China. He wants them to be part of, well, essentially a bit of an armada that would be led by the United States to protect these ships and get the traffic flowing through the Strait of Hormuz again. This is a lot easier said than done, while these Iranian threats to hit any ship that tries to go through that is in any way affiliated or allied with the United States and Israel or its allies. While those threats continue, well, you have to presume that there could be Iranian attacks on warships as well.
Jemana, speaking of Israel, there's a report that's popped up in Semaphore that is exclusive saying that Israel has informed the U.S. this week that it's running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors as the conflict with Iran rages on. Israel has reportedly entered the current war already low on interceptors that were fired during last summer's conflict with Iran. Now, this complements reporting from Bloomberg that UAE and Qatar were also running low on those interceptors. I do need to say both those countries have pushed back vociferously on that reporting. But I'm wondering if you have any sense of the veracity of these reports, if this is something countries in the region are worried about. I mean, it would make sense at this point, but what are they telling you?
I think, you know, let's just go back to the starting point of all of this, which is the asymmetry of the military warfare here. I don't think there's a question that the U.S. and Israel have military dominance. And in fact, if you go back to some of the comments that Central Command have said, they've said that they managed to eliminate around 60 to 70% of missile launchers in Iran, around 60 to 70% of their missile stockpiles. But at the same time, I think most of the region was taken aback at the sheer intensity and frequency of the strikes that came through from Iran onto these Gulf states and indeed onto Israel itself. I mean, just to give you the example of the UAE, they said that they have engaged in over 1,600 drones and 300 missiles launched by Iran since the war began. And this was over 2 weeks ago. Now, as our colleague reporter was just saying, the interception rate for these projectiles is very high. It's between something like 92 to 95%, whether it's drones or missiles. But there is a mismatch in cost. And this is something that Iran recognizes. They're capable of manufacturing these low-cost drones in a huge amount. They're estimated to be sitting on around 50,000 of these drones, and they are costly to take down. And so the longer this war goes on for, the more there are going to be questions about how long these air defense systems can hold up for. I should say, however, that these Gulf states maintain that their air defense systems continue to have very high interception rates, and they are doing what they can to beef them up.
Okay, thank you. Jemana Bersetchi, our Mideast anchor. We've also like to thank Philip Kroller, our AP international correspondent, standing out on that water for us, and Laura Davidson, of course, Washington Deputy Bureau Chief, joining us from Tokyo.
Well, coming up here, we're going to go back to Tokyo, to that summit that Christina mentioned a moment ago, that inaugural Indo-Pacific Energy Security Ministerial and Business Forum. Lee Zeldin, the EPA Administrator, is going to join us from there up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, here on Bloomberg TV, radio, and online.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And oil loading operations at a key port in the United Arab Emirates, well, it has resumed, and that's after a drone strike and a fire forced exports to a halt. Sources telling Bloomberg operations at the Fujairah have restarted. The port sits at the end of a pipeline allowing the UAE to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. It has a capacity of more than 70 million barrels of oil and fuels for traders needing quick supply access. And it also serves as a ship refueling hub. Now, Fujairah caught fire on Saturday due to falling debris from an intercepted drone strike. FCC Chairman Brendan Carr has a warning for broadcasters covering the Iran war. Correct course or risk losing your license. In a social media post, Carr said broadcasters that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as the fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. Now, that warning, it was placed on top of a post from President Donald Trump complaining about coverage of the Middle East conflict. conflict. And Switzerland, keeping its tradition of neutrality in armed conflicts, the federal government in Bern said it closed its airspace for U.S. military flights directly linked to the Iran war. 2 requests for U.S. reconnaissance planes to cross over Switzerland were rejected. 3 other flights, including 2 transport aircraft, were approved. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. Lisa Mateo with those headlines.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so right now, President Trump's National Energy Dominance Council is hosting an energy security forum in Tokyo. This was a conference that was planned before America struck Iran and is happening amid global economic turmoil.
Joining us now from Tokyo is the EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin on this Saturday. Great to have you with us. We're going to talk about the substance of the conversations you've been having here in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you first, remembering as I do, you as a congressman, you as a fellow New Yorker, you've talked an awful lot about the need for there to be end games in military conflict, and you've brought that up in the context of your military service as well, talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. As we look at this war entering the 3rd week, I'm curious what you see that end game as, and if it's clear enough to you as somebody, again, who's served in the military.
Well, obviously, my role serving as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency is a bit different than serving in Congress on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I have the utmost faith and trust in President Trump and his national security and foreign policy team. They have been conducting many successful strikes to achieve strategic objectives, taking out top high-value targets throughout Iran consistently. That progress has resulted in all sorts of people who have been responsible for many attacks that have that not just adversely impacted U.S. interests in that region, but have killed and maimed U.S. service members. As a now retired member of the United States Army, speaking from that perspective, just too many fellow soldiers have been targeted by RGC and Iranian leadership over the course of my adult life since first going into the military in 2003. So seeing that justice brought to bear on behalf of all of those United States service members, their veterans, those families, that is long overdue justice for many of these Iranian quote-unquote leaders who are no longer alive.
I do want to ask you about the summit that you're competing in, especially, you know, oil prices are up 40%. Americans already feel like they're being squeezed. And I know that you're there partially to pitch to Asian countries, because I heard you on some of our other network friends, why America would be a good resource for them for energy, why they should get our energy from us. But my question to you is, many of those same nations, including Vietnam, Thailand, and others, are feeling pressure from the constantly changing U.S. tariff landscape. And they feel like the president is using that as a tool and changes depending on what he wants from foreign policy. So why should Asian nations trust the U.S. as a consistent and dependable source of energy in the future?
Well, one of the points is that you see these Asian countries that have relied so heavily on the Middle East for their crude oil and the time that it takes and the reliance on a route that in many respects a terrorist regime has been able to frequently disrupt, or at the very least threaten to disrupt over the course of years and decades. Now they start looking east to the United States, where we have been unleashing energy dominance here at home with new projects that are now on the horizon. President Trump has been advocating strongly for a new liquid LNG facility, a pipeline that would run alongside the Trans-Alaska pipeline in Alaska. Crude oil in Alaska has the ability to have a lot more oil pass through it. And that route for 60 years with Japan, for example, has been able to deliver that crude oil to Asia, to Japan,
of course, but sir, if I may, how are you
with freedom of navigation?
Of course, I'm sorry for interrupting, but if I may, are you not getting any pushback that even if you make some of these deals and President Trump becomes displeased with these countries, he could claw back that energy?
Well, what we just witnessed over the course of the last 48 hours is that many countries in the Indo-Pacific are gravitating towards the United States. We had over $50 billion worth of deals with U.S. companies. All the dialogue that has taken place has been with an understanding that by entering into new deals with the United States, it allows them to reduce their reliance, which was so heavily concentrated in the Middle East. And on top of it, it takes just a fraction of time to get that energy supply to Japan and these other countries compared to 28 days to get it from the Middle East. It'll take 8 days to get there from Alaska. So that is another dynamic, but just a lot of very robust, energetic, motivated conversation and engagement from the ministers of energy of all of these countries trying to cut deals with the United States.
Mr. Minister,
and actually cutting deals.
You might have heard Christina say at the top here, this is, of course, a summit that was scheduled before the war began. And I'm curious, given what has happened here, how much that situation is kind of coloring the conversations that you're having with allies and companies at the summit over the course of this weekend.
One of the topics that were discussed, one of the pillars of this weekend, is about the supply chain. And for Indo-Pacific countries, they are, I think, far more motivated. They were talking quite frequently about wanting to diversify their supply chain, that they want to start looking elsewhere because they were relying too heavily on the Middle Eastern region for their supply chain. Also diversifying how they provide energy to their people. Some countries are further along in talking about nuclear, others relying more on LNG, others talking about coal. It really ran the gamut, and depending on which country we were sitting in for a bilateral or for meetings amongst all the energy ministers, diversification of the supply chain was not just a pillar going into this weekend, but something that was frequently talked about throughout.
I have a couple of nuclear questions, but I do want to start with when we look at the possible consequences of a regime falling in Iran, one of the concerns we've been hearing from nuclear experts and security experts is how to secure and possibly transport out that enriched uranium in that country. Is there a plan to do it? Does it involve American boots on the ground? And what can you tell us about what's going to happen there?
Yeah, that's a question that I, as administrator of EPA, would not want to answer on behalf of the President of the White House, the Department of War, Department of State, or Department of Energy. The transport of uranium out of Iran and the other aspects of your question are questions that I, as EPA administrator, wouldn't be appropriate to be the one answering. Great questions, but I wouldn't be the right person for the administration to answer that.
Fair enough.
Let me ask you something kind of complementary to the strikes on Iran, and that is we've seen the administration open up those pipelines off the coast of California once again. And there are a lot of Californians who remember that oil spill back in 2015, that Refugio oil spill, are worried about the integrity of those pipelines. And I wonder what your message is to them as we hear from the governor of that state and others saying, look, this is something that shouldn't be happening right now in light of the fact that there are 100,000 gallons of barrels of oil that were spilled as a result of that back in 2015.
Well, I mean, it's always important to remember lessons learned of the past, to be leaning into new technology, to make sure that with new projects for extraction, for processing, anywhere in America, that in the partnerships and in the requests for permits, and as this investment goes forward, that we are learning the lessons of the past and that we're doing it as safely as possible. I often talk about how I strongly believe that in the United States, we tap into our own energy supplies so much safer than so many other countries elsewhere around the world, and that runs across the gamut on all different kinds of ways that energy is extracted. So yeah, to your question, which is a great one, it's important that when these projects, when these permits are moving forward, that we're doing it as responsibly as possible.
I also want to ask you, as you talk about U.S. energy dominance, obviously the president and a lot of people have said the U.S. should look more into nuclear. One of the things your agency and the Department of Energy have done is change some of the regulations for trying to build nuclear plants and nuclear reactors. That's had mixed results because it's trying to bring these plants online faster and solve this issue. But some of the criticism is it's taking away some of the safety concerns, including things like firearms trainings and emergency drills, which critics are saying could make these plants more vulnerable to theft of nuclear power. What is your response to that? And do you have any concerns with lessening regulations around nuclear reactors?
At no point since I was sworn in as administrator 14 months ago with any nuclear project that I've seen anywhere inside the United States have I seen anything but the highest level of competency brought to bear with very incredible staffers, many career staffers here at EPA doing our due diligence. Trump's speed is about operating quickly. The way that we have implemented that directive from the president is one that I can very confidently say, with eyes on many different nuclear projects across this country, that they're being done extraordinarily competently. And quite frankly, the people, the companies that are making the big investment, they have every motivation to protect that investment. And I would say that a lot of these companies are breaking ground on projects with goals of breaking ground on many more projects. So it's almost a proof of concept when, Oklo in Idaho Falls, Idaho is breaking ground, which they have recently done. They want to build many more. I can think of their project in Oak Ridge in Tennessee, as well as other states. Right now, there are a lot of retrofits, a lot of small modular reactors. There are a lot of nuclear projects. Yes, the permitting is going much faster under President Trump, but due diligence and competency has been all over from the government standpoint as well as from the investor standpoint.
Mr. Administrator, thank you very much. That's Lee Zeldin joining us from Tokyo, where the sun is setting as it rises here in New York. He's there for that inaugural Indo-Pacific Energy Security Ministerial and Business Forum. Great to get his perspective on this.
We appreciate him staying up late. It's 8:30. I'm not sure if he's coming from or going to dinner, but we appreciate your time, sir. Energy continues to be a really important conversation. It is the backdrop, of course, for everything that's going on right now. Coming up in our 9 o'clock hour, we're going to speak live with Democratic Congressman Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, and Republican Congressman Mike Lawler, who is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. That's ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend. What can we learn from past conflicts in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, and what can that tell us about how the latest conflict in Iran could end? Quote, history does not predict the fate of the Islamic Republic, Sir Lawrence Freedman writes in this week's Forecast newsletter. But history, he says, does issue warnings.
Sir Lawrence is Emeritus Professor at War Studies at King's College London with a Substack called Comment is Freed, and he joins us now. Sir Lawrence, thank you very much for being here. I want to start with the disagreement that we see among administration officials here in the U.S. No clear, unified rationale for this war, and I'm curious what history tells us about the potential problems or perils of going to war without a clearly identified goal or mission.
Well, it tells us it's a bad idea. I think the problem is that there are things that the administration identified that it could do, and to some extent these are its war aims and can be achieved. They can do things to the nuclear program that they thought they'd done last June, but maybe need doing again. They can degrade the missile capabilities, production of Iran. They've taken out an awful lot of its navy. All of those things can be done, and if you wanted to say they were a success, you could do. But they said they were going to do more. They said they were going to achieve regime change, but they've got no obvious means of doing so. So that's getting a bit played down. But what they didn't do is prepare their allies or the US people for the things that Iran might be able to do, which is basically make it very difficult to move shipping in and around the Gulf and to threaten installations within the main Gulf states, Emiratis, Saudis, Qatar, and so on. And that's where their problems really lie, is they don't quite know how to bring this to a conclusion at the moment.
And on that note, when you talk about how to bring this to a conclusion, you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of achieving those objectives with or without boots on the ground. You know, the problem that you write is that not having boots on the ground is a good way to avoid getting caught up in a long and frustrating conflict, but it also makes it harder to guide the final outcome or achieve your goals, and could last longer, I guess, right?
I think, the difficulty you've got is that if you put good boots on the ground, as it's normally put land forces in, first, it doesn't necessarily itself guarantee success, as the Russians have found in Ukraine. And remember, Iran is a country of 90 million people. But then you've got the country. Then you're responsible for its occupation and administration. And Iran is in a mess. I mean, economically, never mind what's the battering it's recently taken. So understandably, the administration doesn't want to have any part of that. But that means that it's got no means of dealing with the regime. And the consequences of the regime falling on its own accord, which is possible, though I think less likely now immediately, but it's possible, is that you have chaos. You have chaos in this very large and important country. And you're not necessarily able to do very much about that either. So the problem is, in doing things solely from the air, is that you set things in motion, but you can't control how they end up. And we get to the stage in practice where the main priority of the administration at the moment is really how to stop the Iranians doing harm to America's allies and friends in the region, rather than making sure that the regime itself falls.
When one looks for parallels to past conflicts, so I think chiefly about the second war with Iraq, there was a robust public debate in the run-up to it. We saw the administration go to Congress and to the UN Security Council. That, of course, didn't happen this time around. And I'm curious what that says to you about the likely trajectory, not trying to amass a coalition of allies internationally or indeed domestically.
Well, I think first, when things go wrong, you own it. I mean, this is President Trump's war, to some extent Bibi Netanyahu's war. They own it. If things go wrong, they get the blame. Secondly, allies have got reason to be quite cross that their economies have been put in jeopardy, people are getting killed. It's all very stressful, and they weren't really warned in advance. They weren't consulted on the wisdom of all of this. They may have put in their views, but as we know with this administration, the way that decisions get made can be quite abrupt, and depending on the mood of the president. And so I think you've created a situation where allies are scrambling around themselves to deal with a problem not of their making, and without confidence that the administration can sort it out. A good example of this is the promise to provide naval escorts to get ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which the president made, but which can't be fulfilled because the ships aren't there or it's too dangerous for them to travel themselves. So I think there's going to be, the aftermath of this is going to be a lot of rethinking about how, from the Allies' perspective, they deal with the US, and hopefully a certain amount of rethinking in the US about the advisability of consulting allies and taking their interest into account when you launch something like this.
Quickly before we let you go, you talked about the things that can go wrong. One of the things that seems to have gone wrong is that in these strikes, the U.S. seems to have knocked out a lot of the potentially more moderate leaders who could take over. Is there a possibility that the Trump administration ends up with a regime that doesn't fall and is more extreme than the one it replaced?
Yes, I mean, to be honest, I think the likelihood that they would find some pragmatic guy who would do the same job that was done by the number two in Venezuela was always a bit fanciful. But certainly the Israeli strikes went further than the Trump administration seems to have expected. We're now in a position essentially where the IOGC, the Revolutionary Guard, is running the country. The hardliners are in charge at the moment. That's why they took risks with Hezbollah in hitting Israel from Lebanon, and are now seem pretty determined to push this as hard as they can. You know, from their perspective, they've got quite a coalition ranged against them. So they've got to take advantage of their main leverage at the moment, was the damage to the international economy, while they can, and see if they can get some guarantees from everybody else out of that. So, this is a regime fighting for its survival, and will fight hard.
Sir Lawrence, thank you very much. That's Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. You can read more of his essay and get a jumpstart on your week ahead with the Forecast newsletter. Subscribe at bloomberg.com/newsletters.
Thank you, Christina and David. Let's get you updated on today's top stories. And Nvidia's GTC conference, well, it kicks off tomorrow. CEO Jensen Huang will deliver a keynote, also attend a news conference. Market watchers, they're going to be focused on new project announcements, also demand trends, and Nvidia's roadmap for next generation accelerators. Over to sports, Swedish superstar Ludvig Åberg attending today's final round in the Players' Championship in Florida at the top of the leaderboard. He's hoping to become the first player since Rory McIlroy in 2019 to lead at the 36-hole mark at the competition and go on to win it. And tonight, Team USA, it takes on the Dominican Republic in the World Baseball Classic semifinals in Miami. The U.S. advanced to the semis with a close 5-3 win over Canada on Friday. The DR mercy ruled Korea with a 10-0 beatdown in 7 innings. Also tonight, yes, the 98th Academy Awards hosted by Conan O'Brien. Sinners, that leads the nominees with 16 nods, the most Oscars in history, one battle after another. That follows with 13 nominations. Marty Supreme, Frankenstein, Sentimental Value, and Hamnet are also high on the mix. It kicks off from the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles, 7 p.m. Eastern. David and Christina, it's the first time I'm able to watch
You're
it,
going to watch it.
I can stay up late.
Your weekend
I can party on a Sunday.
looms large. I'm excited for Conan, whom I like.
Yes.
Lisa, since you nailed those golf pronunciations, I want to show you guys something. I practiced something. Timothy Chalamet.
No,
yes.
Chalamet. Oh my God.
No. You will get it. You'll get there, girl.
Best laid plans. Incredible.
Okay, well, that was...
You'll be watching.
What a letdown.
I will. I'm excited. I haven't seen like all of them, but the Sinners, the one battle after another, like those were really good and like top of my list.
Who was your best picture? Who are you rooting for?
Michael B. Jordan.
Michael B. Jordan.
I don't know. He's won a couple up to this moment, so we'll see what happens.
Yes. All right. We'll be watching as well. I'll be watching. Provided I can stay awake.
I was going to say we're going to put it in the group chat. We'll put it in the group chat.
I wanted to talk about that mercy rule. These games are kind of brutal.
Yes,
those teams.
10-0.
We'll come back to that later. All right, up next, a big sports day. Get ready for your March Madness brackets. You can do that starting tonight as well. Bloomberg's Brackets for a Cause gets underway later this week as well. We're going to have the Business of Sports podcast co-host Vanessa Perdomo joining us here on Bloomberg This Weekend shortly to talk about the NCAA men's basketball tournament, women's basketball tournament as well.
And I will be practicing all of my pronunciations in the break. Thank you all for your patience. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. This Sunday is not only Oscar Sunday, it is also Selection Sunday. That's right. It is a big deal for college basketball fans.
Say it like you mean it, with conviction.
You know how good I am at the sports ball, but I do like a bracket. I'm not going to lie. I know nothing about them, but this is fun. This is fun for all.
March Madness kicking off this week. Tonight we're going to find out which teams have made it to the big dance, and here to help us figure out who those teams are likely to be so you can put them in your bracket. I don't know how you select your teams.
Pure chance.
Based on mascots.
Based on
chance,
mascots, color schemes. Although, you know what? Sometimes that works as well as people have actual knowledge.
That's true.
So.
He's the host of our Business of Sports podcast, Vanessa Perdomo, joins us now.
Who was nodding along with me.
She was nodding. I think she might have a more sophisticated calculus than you when it comes to picking her teams. We'll get into that in just a moment. Vanessa, great to have you with us. Let me ask you, first of all, just sort of what colors this season's NCAA tournament? We see a lot of ads for sports betting, for instance. It does feel like we've kind of entered a new terrain or iteration of March Madness with the advent and legalization of sports betting.
I mean, it's absolutely one of the biggest, things of the year, one of the biggest betting events on the calendar. It's actually bet on more than the Super Bowl, considering the amount of games that March Madness has. There's, projection of over $3 billion will be bet on this year's March Madness. And that only includes sports books, not even considering prediction markets, which is now one of the biggest things that people are really getting into this year.
Is that taking some of the fun away from this? I mean, my introduction to March Madness is like a college pool, a bunch of cash. You're talking to people you never talked to in your office. It was like adorable in its sketchiness. I don't know. The fact that it's been commodified, Are people still, I mean, obviously $3.3 billion, people are still enjoying it, but has it changed the vibe of March Madness to something a little bit more serious?
I don't think so. I think, it's almost exactly what we want, what they want, and what we've already been doing with filling out your bracket, like you were saying before. I mean, people just throw random things in there. So it's the same thing with betting on the game. You're hoping that Cinderella story, that 11 seed is going to come through and make it to the Elite Eight or the Final Four. And I think really what it's doing is giving people exactly what they were already writing down in their brackets, but it's giving them an opportunity to actually make money on it. And it's just really the same exact thing, just now they're making money on it, and the sports books are very happy as well.
I want to get your counsel on who we should be looking to for maybe some of those Cinderella stories. So yesterday I was having a beverage of my choice and watching the Vanderbilt-Florida game. Very exciting. Vanderbilt won that unexpectedly. So we've had these conference tournaments happening. Who are you looking at? Who stands perhaps to surprise all of us here as we look ahead to March Madness?
I went to Duquesne University, so I'm a big fan of the A10, and A10 actually, they're one of the conferences that actually usually kind of get in there, and they have about 3 or 4 seeds. So I'm a little bit of a homer in that way, but if you are filling out your brackets, if you are looking to place a bet, usually those 11 seeds that we'll see today in Selection Sunday, who those will be, but usually those 11 seeds, those 12 seeds are the ones you want to put your money on.
Obviously, lots of money, lots of interest.
Yes.
But I have been informed, because I am new to Bloomberg, there's something called Bloomberg's Bracket for a Cause. This is the 11th year, and the website goes live this week. Explain what this is and why we do it, and how much money is raised.
Yeah, so Bloomberg Bracket for a Cause is something that's been going on for over 10 years. CEOs, investors, hedge fund managers, they all come together. They pledge $20,000 for exactly what we're talking about. They're filling out their brackets, and they're also just raising money for charity, which is amazing. Whitney Wolf Hurd, actually the founder of Bumble, has won the last 2 years in a row. And she's raising money for Baby to Baby, I think, which is a organization that helps child poverty. And I've written the story, and I've talked to some of the investors, and they actually have a little bit more of a hedge than me and you filling out our brackets, because they see it as a investment. They see it as looking at those little things that they look to in the market. They're doing that exact same thing when they're filling out their college brackets.
Vanessa, how could someone possibly have more interest in analytics and filling out the brackets than me, as we've already established, as I choose by cute mascots and color choices? But all right, I'll give you that one.
On that note, my last question, kind of looking at the zeitgeist, looking at this moment, I've heard from a few friends that they're going to rely on AI to help pick their brackets this year. And I'm thinking maybe that's going to be a phenomenon here as well. Yeah, I mean, that could tell you a good deal, I imagine, just about past, not that past performance is a guarantee of future success. But are you hearing that as well, Vanessa? Is that a thing as well? People using AI to kind of figure out what they're going to put in their brackets?
It's absolutely something that a tool that people use, and it's helpful. Obviously, coaches use it sometimes to try and figure out what their game plan is going to be. But at the same time, I think AI knows just as much as everyone else does in terms of March Madness. I mean, they call it that for a reason. Cinderella stories happen every year, but the reality is, number 1 seeds tend to win.
We haven't talked about the women's bracket yet. UConn, seemingly unstoppable. Yet again, we talk about the success of Brackets for a Cause, and it's winner year after year. UConn, winner year after year here, and looking like they're in a very strong position going into the women's March Madness as well.
It's an amazing story for UConn. I mean, they won last year with Paige Beckers, and she finally got her ring. And now AZ Fudd trying to do the same thing as she goes in her last year before she goes to the WNBA. They're undefeated. They're looking extremely strong, but I also wouldn't put it past UCLA is another team that I would really look at, with Lauren Betts also doing the same thing in one of her last years before she goes to the WNBA.
Vanessa, great to talk to you. Vanessa Perdomo, the host of the Business of Sports podcast here at Bloomberg News, reports on the business of sports as well. Good luck, Christina.
Thank you so much. Vanessa, I'm going to send you my bracket. You can give me thumbs up and thumbs down. Yeah,
I feel like that's...
Mark it up, please. I got to beat David. Please help me.
We'll see. We shall see.
All right. We are approaching the 8 a.m. hour in New York. Still ahead, the perspective from Iran about the future of what that country holds as this war continues.
The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend, starting on Bloomberg Television, radio, and online on the Bloomberg Business app, starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
This is Bloomberg This Weekend live on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, at Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. We are here every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And Christina, another big morning of news out of the Middle East this morning.
Of course. Welcome back. I'm Christina Ruffini. We're going to start today with new developments overnight out of the Middle East. The Pentagon has identified the 6 service members killed when a refueling plane crashed in Iraq. That's Captain Seth Koval, Captain Curtis Angst, Major John Kilner, Technical Sergeant Tyler Simmons, Technical Sergeant Ashley Pruitt, and Captain Ariana Savino. Those faces there, the real cost of this conflict. As any conflict kicks off, there are always human costs to those objectives.
Certainly something that the president warned about when he announced the start of this war now about 3 weeks ago. As we look at it widening over the course of that period of time, yes, the target was Iran initially, but we've seen it really grow geographically, and certainly seeing this front emerge in Lebanon as well. We're going to talk a bit about that over the course of this hour, the degree which Israel is making an incursion there. I think 700 people have died in Lebanon already.
Yes, and we also want to look at the reaction from Iran, which has really startled allies. A Bloomberg analysis shows 823 documented Iranian airstrikes, 483 of those which were intercepted. But as this drags on, as we've talked about, and we will talk about more, how long can these countries continue to intercept these? That costs money, that costs time, and there are not that many interceptors. It's not an infinite supply for anyone, despite those countries pushing back against reports saying they are possibly running low on those munitions.
As we have been, we're going to be covering this from across the region, covering the political costs of this in the U.S. As well here in the coming hours. You have President Trump having a phone interview with NBC News last night, talking about his thinking on the war at this point in time, how he's thinking about the end game for this war as well. Going to get into all of that here in the next hour. But first, let's get to the headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa.
And let's start with that interview there, David. President Donald Trump says he wants better terms to end the war in Iran, and this is as the conflict does continue. It was a 30-minute phone interview with NBC News. Now, the president said Iran is ready to negotiate a ceasefire, but the terms just aren't good enough yet. He did not say what those terms were. Now, Trump also dismissed concerns about rising gas prices and also questioned whether Iran's new supreme leader is even alive. At the same time, the president ramping up the pressure on Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, calling on countries to send warships to help commercial vessels pass through safely. In a social media post, the president gave little detail beyond saying he hoped that China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK would all pitch in. Now, in another post, the president added that the U.S. will provide help for those nations which take care of the passage. Iran's foreign minister responded saying the strait was only shut to ships from, quote, enemies. About a fifth of the world's oil supplies normally flow through Hormuz. Now, this all comes after President Trump ordered a strike on military sites on Kharg Island. Now, that's from which Iran exports most of its oil. Speaking from Beirut, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he called for an immediate end to hostilities, also a stop to the Israeli bombing in Lebanon and rocket fire by Hezbollah.
First of all, the UN is extremely active. The proof is my presence here. And our special representative is actively engaged with the parties in order to create conditions for, as soon as possible, to stop this war and to restart a serious process of negotiation.
And meanwhile, oil loading operations at a key port in the United Arab Emirates has resumed. That's after a drone strike and fire forced exports to a halt. Now, sources tell Bloomberg operations at Fujairah have also restarted. Now, the port sits at the end of a pipeline allowing the UAE to bypass that Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. and China trade talks, they are underway in Paris. Taking part in negotiations are U.S. Trade Secretary Scott Bessent, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and also China's Vice Premier He Lingfeng. They're expected to review those last developments in a truce that was also reached in November. Also, of course, discuss the war in Iran, as well as also investment and purchases. And these talks, David and Christina, of course, they come just ahead of Donald Trump's trip to China later.
Pivotal, paving the way for those talks, that summit that's going to take place here at the start of April. Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate those headlines. And back with us this morning, we have the host of Bloomberg's Horizons Middle East and Africa, Jumana Versace, along with Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News. He's traveling with the president this weekend, as you can see, traveling at this very moment.
I believe Jeff just got out of the press vans.
Yes,
I think Jeff and his hat are out of the press vans.
Jeff, great to have you with us. And something we've been talking about over the course of the morning is this interview that the president did with NBC News. The president saying during the course of that interview, he doesn't know if the new Iranian supreme leader is alive. So far, nobody has been able to show him, he said. Walk us through the president's latest thinking on this war, where it's headed, and what we learned from that interview.
Well, it is interesting that he mentioned that they're wondering whether or not the supreme leader is alive. It was interesting to me as well on Friday when Secretary Hegseth said that the new supreme leader had been injured and was likely disfigured. That was a suggestion that they thought that he was alive. So the president saying that now is just a little bit more of a hint at the ambiguity that the United States apparently is having about the leadership in Iran. More broadly, his comment that he was not interested in the deal that Iran has apparently shown some willingness to take is also, I think, a signal that the president is willing to keep this war going much longer because he's not done. And that is also going to be something that will be sensitive to the markets on Monday.
And Jeff, before you have to resume your pool duties, I didn't know if you saw this tweet from John Bolton this morning, who we had on our show, I think last weekend, who, of course, is known as, even in President Trump's first term, one of the strongest Iran hawks. He's been pushing for regime change almost as long as he's been a public figure. This was pretty remarkable. He said, "I favor regime change in Iran, but I'm deeply worried that inadequate preparation will prevent that goal from being achieved. There seem to be holes in the strategy, from the lack of coordination with the opposition to the lapse in preparing American people ahead of the attack." Has anyone in the administration responded to this tweet? And do you think this will flag on their radar at all?
Good question. I haven't seen any response to that tweet. It is remarkable for a couple different reasons. And one is the one that you said, that John Bolton, of course, is definitely an Iran hawk and has been pushing for something like this for some time. Also, though, worth noting that he and President Trump had a major falling out. And so just a falling out to the extent that the president canceled the ambassador's security detail.
Right, which was for threats from Iran, actually. Yes.
Ding, ding, ding. That's exactly right. So I think it's not surprising that that Ambassador Bolton would have some criticisms, even if it's largely a policy that he would have supported. But it's also coming from someone who really knows this stuff. So if he is suggesting that not enough preparation was put into place, then he's coming from a position of knowledge when he makes that critique.
Jeff Mason, on pool duty this weekend, traveling with the president in Florida. You see him there outside the press van, no doubt having to get into it soon. Jeff, thank you very much for that update this morning. I want to turn to Jumana Bersetchi now. And as I mentioned Jumana just a few moments ago, Lebanon really front of mind for us this morning. Lisa Mateo in that news update giving us a sense of what the UN Secretary General has said about the prospects for there being a real humanitarian catastrophe there as this incursion continues. What can you tell us about what Israel said about its objectives there as we look at it really encroaching on a lot of territory?
Yeah, well, this is a parallel front that's opening up. And I just want to give you a little bit of context, because the last time this flared up was back in 2024. A ceasefire was agreed to in November 2024 that was put together by the Biden administration. Amos Hochstein was one of the key negotiators. And the terms stipulated that Hezbollah would have to fully disarm. The Lebanese armed forces, i.e. the army, would take care of the southern part of the country, south of a river called the Litani River. And Israel would withdraw from strategic points that it had taken over from a ground offensive that it had launched in that war. Now, you fast forward to today, there were multiple violations over the course of that ceasefire. There was a lack of monitoring, and also there were serious questions about the lengths that the Lebanese government had gone to with the effective disarmament of Hezbollah. They maintained that they had disarmed Hezbollah south of the Litani, but many reports suggested that Hezbollah had indeed rearmed and reconstituted in other parts of the country. So what happened is, in the early days of the war, Hezbollah launched an operation in conjunction with the IRGC into northern Israel. That prompted a very strong response out of Israel. They sent a notice to hundreds of thousands of residents in southern Lebanon to evacuate. It's now estimated that about 800,000 people have been displaced. They've been dropping leaflets over central parts of Beirut, warning residents that if they are close to to any Hezbollah assets or Hezbollah members, then they may be at risk as well. And they have proceeded with quite an aggressive aerial campaign. The death toll in Lebanon, per the latest number, is up to 700. Now, there was some reporting overnight suggesting that the Lebanese president has reached out to the French President Macron to reopen those diplomatic channels, to re-engage in direct discussions in order to bring down the temperature and perhaps to reach to some form of a non-belligerence agreement over the next month. But the real question here is, number one, how much effective control the Lebanese government has over Hezbollah and whether they can really administer an effective disarmament, which has been a big issue now for several years. And number two, whether from Israel's perspective, they actually believe that the government can follow through, number one, on the disarmament so that Hezbollah doesn't pose a threat anymore, and number two, on monitoring established by an international community to make sure that there are no further violations. So for all intents and purposes, this is another front that has flared up. And I will tell you, I've spoken to diplomats over the past week. They think even if the Iran war ends tomorrow, the Lebanese front will continue going for as long as Hezbollah continue to have arms.
But this has been an ongoing issue, and I remember seeing the video of those leaflets, which initially people thought were munitions because they blow and then all the leaflets kind of rain down, as you said, warning people to get out. But anybody who's been to Lebanon knows it's not quite that easy, because it's not like here is Hezbollah and here is everybody else. You know, these pockets, even within Beirut, are in certain neighborhoods, and there's reports of bombing in Baalbek, which is a more rural area with some absolutely incredible historical things there as well. That is known as more of a Hezbollah Iranian stronghold, but there are also civilians there. So what are you hearing? I know you have contacts and folks that you know in the country. What are you hearing about how people are trying to protect themselves and if they even know where to go at this point?
Like, this is a huge humanitarian crisis, and you'll see images of hundreds of thousands of people strewn over the country. They're being jammed into shelters, into schools. You know, many of them are not getting access to food, water, medicine. I was reading a report about a pregnant lady that had to give birth on the side of the street because she didn't have access to a hospital. So indeed, mounting humanitarian costs. But at the same time, this is an economy that was already crippled. It was contracting years of blocked financial system, a banking system that has essentially been frozen, and it had been on so-called the path to recovery with this new Lebanese government that was formed in early 2025, close to the Americans, had said all the right things, and actually a few days after Hezbollah launched those attacks into northern Israel, an unprecedented statement came through from the Lebanese government, essentially outlawing unilateral military activity from Hezbollah and threatening to arrest anyone who conducted military outside the realm of the state. But again, as I was saying, it comes back to how they can implement this, how can they administer it in the absence of international support. And what our own reporting suggests is that because the U.S. administration is so focused on Iran right now, Lebanon, to a certain degree, has sort of moved to the back burner. But whether it becomes a front and a center issue again is going to be very important also for the region, and Israel will maintain for their own security as well.
Mehrzad, our Mideast anchor, joining us yet again on your weekend. Thank you so much for your perspective. We really appreciate it.
I want to turn to markets and economy now. Of course, as the war in Iran heads into its third week, market futures in the U.S. look bleak as the price of oil continues to climb at a dizzying pace to the unprecedented supply disruption as traffic comes to a standstill in the Strait of Hormuz, as we've been discussing. Joining us now is Bloomberg senior reporter Bailey Lipschultz here with us on set in New York. And Bailey, I want to talk about the energy market in just a second, but let's talk stocks too, because that's, of course, had a huge amount of interplay with what we've seen geopolitically. Global stocks have lost 5.5% since the start of this conflict. To what degree is this front and center for investors' minds right now? We were already in a situation where there was concern about AI and private credit. What role is this playing as investors look ahead to the week?
Well, this is dominating the conversation. As we saw this week, just looking at U.S. equities, the second there was any perception that there could be a near-term end to the conflict, a near-term end to the war, we saw equities rallying because investors want to get back in and get back onto some of the risk-on trades that we've seen.
Looking for any sliver of hope.
Looking for any sliver of hope, but the big question is, what does that ultimate resolution look like? And when you look at the knock-on effects of oil above $100 a barrel, oil potentially at $150 a barrel, what that ultimately means for the U.S. economy, ultimately means for actual companies in the supply chain. The big question is, how are these updates going to be distributed, and what's actually going to end up happening? And we've seen investors, whether you're in different assets, really ramping up kind of protection for what this volatility could bring.
When we heard the announcement from the U.S. administration and others that they were going to start releasing oil from those strategic reserves, the markets didn't really react very positively. Yes, you shrug. Why?
Well, it's not that big of a deal to an extent. I mean, you're looking at, when you break out the math, this only can kind of take off the edge, if you will. It doesn't actually fix the ultimate issue, which is how long is the Strait of Hormuz closed, and what does that ultimately look like when it is reopened, and ultimately the knock-on effects. Yes, you can say maybe releasing some of the oil helps with things like gas prices. That helps the ultimate consumer, but that doesn't actually fix the issue. That's what investors are looking for. They want to see a Middle East that is actually somewhat of a calm, and that helps them kind of dial up risk and make their investment decisions, as opposed to saying, okay, well, at least consumers can continue to buy groceries, and gas is going to go back towards what we saw before.
But they're looking at the systemic issue and not seeing a near-term resolution, despite messaging from the White House that everything is fine and it'll be resolved in turn.
Correct.
Still reverberating in my head is what David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, said to Bloomberg a couple of weeks back at the start of this conflict, that he thought that the market was kind of underestimating the magnitude of it. And I'm curious if he still stands out to you as an outlier saying that, or if we've seen more professional investors, executives kind of coalescing around the idea that, as indefinite as this is, how long it goes on, it might have a more profound impact on markets.
No, I think that was the conversation I was having even leading up to the initial attacks with investors was, are markets pricing in the potential risk of what this could bring? The resounding kind of consensus was, no, it is not, but we're not worrying about that until it ultimately does happen. Here we are a few weeks later, it has taken place. Markets are not anywhere near as down as I think as much many investors would have expected because of the ultimate knock-on effects, but there still is a lot of uncertainty around what this ultimately looks like.
Very quickly, what are you most worried about, and what are you least worried about?
Most worried about oil potentially getting back up towards 150. I think the knock-on effects, if that does potentially throw us into a recession, that is a key concern.
Because it touches everything?
Because it ultimately does have an impact on the U.S. economy. We do have the Fed decision later this week. Least concerned about, I don't know. It feels like everything's pretty bad right now.
Bailey Lipschultz is going to come back with us.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to have you on
I just
set.
want to highlight here, I mean, I mentioned that decline in global stocks to 5.5%, but I really think that the kind of decline in financials is fascinating. We're seeing that in the S&P 500 Financials Index. We're seeing that in the KBW Bank Index. And when you come back, Bailey, we'll talk a bit more about that. Again, there's so much kind of roiling in the background here. Yes, there is this war, of course, but those concerns about AI and private credit persist. We'll talk about that a little bit more when you come back on the show here in just a few minutes' time.
Thank you so much for joining us. Wow, concerned about everything. That's really great.
Good.
It's nice. It's lots more for me to study. It's going to be good. But look, this is the thing with oil, right? It does touch every aspect of the economy, and we haven't even really seen those secondary or tertiary effects like manufacturing in Asia or just everyday products that hasn't quite reached yet.
Yeah. Well, coming up here, will the president's efforts to calm the energy markets end up benefiting American adversaries? And how does this impact the still ongoing war in Ukraine? That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of our top stories and the conflict in the Middle East showing no signs of slowing. That's right, U.S. and Israel. They continued striking Iran, which in turn carried on attacking Arab Gulf states. Now, with the U.S. telling Americans to leave Iraq immediately due to the, quote, significant threat posed by Iran-aligned terrorist militia groups. According to tolls from governments and non-governmental organizations, roughly 3,750 people have been killed across the region since the war began on February 28th. Well, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr has a warning for broadcasters covering the Iran war. Correct course or risk losing your license. In a social media post, Carr said, quote, broadcasters that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as the fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. Now, that warning, it was placed on top of a post from the president, Donald Trump, complaining about coverage of the Middle East conflict. And 3 more members of the Iranian Women's Suffrage soccer team granted asylum by Australia last week have decided to return to Iran. That's according to Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke. And the players, they were granted humanitarian visas due to persecution fears after Iranian state media described them as traitors for not singing their country's national anthem before one of their games in the Women's Asian Cup. David and Christina, over to you.
Yeah, that was a really scary story. And Australian authorities kind of had to approach them at the hotel and like give them all their options. And then some of them walked out through the lobby reportedly. And then some of them on the way to the airport changed their minds, because as you guys know, defection is not just about you. It's also about ramifications for your family.
Your family.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Joining us now, we want to go to two experts on the Middle East region. Flavia Krauss-Jackson is Bloomberg's executive editor covering economics and politics for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Quite the portfolio. And Karen Young is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. Karen, I'm going to start with you, even though I did not get into Columbia for grad school, and I'm not still upset about it 10 years from now. When you look at what's going on right now, how do you think the Middle East conflict is going to have an impact on commodities beyond what we keep talking about, which is oil?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, as your program was noting earlier, I mean, sort of the second order effects, the add-on effects of this supply disruption, and it's really a transit disruption at this point, but becomes more and more of a worry of supply disruption. First to jet fuel, to diesel, to those kind of refined products that come specifically from big refineries like the one in Kuwait that can't get out of the Persian Gulf right now. So those are kind of the products that are different from crude, which are going to have very, very important effects. Cooking gas, LPG, for a lot of small East Asian economies, this is going to be a real impact to normal people's day-to-day lives. They don't have access to those products, and they're becoming more and more expensive. And then we get into products, particularly products that are made from natural gas and LNG. And so with 20% of global LNG supply disrupted because of the force majeure of Ras Laffan in Qatar, that is having important effects on all kinds of industrial processes, including what's manufactured inside of the GCC. So we've seen some shutdowns and force majeure of aluminum production in Bahrain, start to worry about that in other GCC states as well. So, in the processing of metals that we use, anything that requires sulfur, which is made from crude, so that's in refining metals like copper, things that we use for the production of semiconductor chips. This is just, series after series of add-on effects that we can expect to see.
Flavia, I want to linger, if we could, on the loneliness of Israel and the U.S. at this moment. And I know you've been reading through NBC's write-up of its interview with President Trump over the course of this morning, as we all have. And in there is this element of hope on the president's part that other nations and allies are going to come to the Strait of Hormuz and help the U.S. in clearing that strait, reopening it to traffic. I wonder how you think about the U.S. and Israel's role vis-a-vis those allies at this point in time. This is a military campaign that they've prosecuted here largely alone. And this news of the president's hope that that happens comes on the heels of what Bloomberg's reported, that India has been on the phone with Tehran and was able to broker some safe passage for two of its tankers carrying liquefied natural gas. How do you see the U.S. and Israel at this moment in that broader global context?
Yeah, I mean, it's a number of very interesting things, because if you're Giorgia Meloni in Italy or Macron in France, you're essentially seeing a whole whiplash effect of what Trump says one day and what he says the other. It's gone from this is over, we've won, it's going to be done very, very soon, we don't need you, to, hey, by the way, it'd be great if you could help us. So I think in all these capitals, there's a sense of bewilderment, a sense of betrayal. It's not just the Europeans, by the way, that are used to being on the bad side of Trump and getting flagged off fairly regularly. More significantly, some of the smaller Gulf nations are really, really annoyed. They're really feeling that they were hung up to dry. This is not a war they wanted. In fact, I think most people privately in various places in the Gulf and in Europe will say we weren't consulted about this at all, and now we're being asked to help. So this puts all of these leaders and experts and diplomats in a fairly difficult position, because even as recently as last week, when President Donald Trump addressed G7 leaders, in those calls, no one really publicly wants to contradict them, and they will sort of say, very well done, this is a terrible regime. But privately, I think we're in the kind of world where everyone is looking out for themselves. So as you sort of just noted, Turkey has found safe passage. India's in its own talks. Macron is having those talks. And I think everyone is privately trying to get their ships through and seeing what kind of back channels they can work. And everyone is trying to speak to the Iranians. So I think you've got a very interesting position right now if you're going to look at what Trump said very publicly, saying Iran wants to end this war. Well, in fact, the foreign minister has come out and said, hold on a second, there are no specific proposals. So I think just to recap, just to put it very bluntly, for Israel, this is existential. They will go, they've wanted this war, they've wanted it for 20, 30 years, and it's not affected them in the same way. Trump wants a short-term gain. I mean, not that long ago, he compared it to Venezuela. He thought he could get that outcome. And for Iran, it's about survival. So when you're looking at those stakes, the country that actually wants this wrapped up soonest is the U.S.
Yeah, and the foreign minister actually said Iran was open to any regional initiative that leads to a fair end of the war. And that word regional stands out to me because that's assuming it wants to work with Gulf allies, not just with the U.S. or Israel. Karen, I want to ask you, you wrote an article before this latest conflict talking about the lack of an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz for that energy coming out of the Middle East. You said, quote, the region has no available pipeline infrastructure capable of fully bypassing the Strait of Hormuz and diverting this volume of oil to other ports such as those in the Red Sea or Gulf of Oman. I know the Saudis are trying to onboard another pipeline that goes out to the Red Sea. Is that there's just nothing that is currently feasible that can bypass this route in any meaningful way? And are there any projects starting or in the works or even in the planning process to do so?
So we have the East-West pipeline that goes through Saudi Arabia to Yanbu. The problem there is loading. So you can only load about 3 million barrels a day out of Yanbu. Aramco is working really hard to get that number up. But still, we're seeing, at least what was 15 million barrels a day of crude and 4 million barrels of refined products. So at least a disruption in the 12 million barrel a day range. And that just can't go through the East-West pipeline. And it can't go through the pipeline through the UAE that goes to Fujairah. So it's just not enough capacity. Now, the time it would take to build a new pipeline, sure, that's a good idea. And we've seen calls even from the Qatari government that the GCC itself should be more unified in more of a defensive structure, more NATO-like, but also in terms of thinking about its economic and energy security. But we're years away from that kind of political cohesion, but also in terms of the financing and the building of the infrastructure that would be required. So I don't think that's feasible, certainly for this conflict, maybe for a future one. But if I could just say a word in terms of what would satisfactory ceasefire or outcomes of or ending the conflict right now. And that's where we have just huge differences from the Israeli perspective, the American perspective, and the GCC state perspective. The Israelis would be totally okay with a fragmented, disordered, even, Iran in a state of civil war. That is not okay from an American perspective. Donald Trump wants to see Iran as economically viable, particularly in its energy export capacity, and is more comfortable with some sort of structure that is authoritarian in nature, perhaps even the IRGC in charge, but defanged on the nuclear side and also on their missiles program. What the GCC is totally uncomfortable with, and the reason why there is so much just frustration right now, is that Iran can exist in the capacity of low-level violence against its neighbors, against anybody globally, for a very, very long time. And that kind of disruption, not just to energy exports, but to domestic non-oil economy, tourism, manufacturing, financial services. Those are the things that the Gulf states need to grow and to be the nodes in the global economy that they're trying to be. And Iran poses a direct threat to that and will continue to do so, even if it's in a state of transition or disarray that the other combatants, the only combatants, Israel and the United States in this conflict, would see as likely more acceptable.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Karen Young of Columbia University and Flavia Krauss-Jackson, Bloomberg's News Executive Editor for Economics and Politics in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Thank you both so much.
Well, President Trump has encouraged Iranians to rise up against the regime. That has not happened, of course, in that country. We're going to talk to an Iranian-American professor about what's happening on the ground in Tehran.
But first, from Bloomberg Originals, Bloomberg intelligence analyst Will Harris and Bloomberg senior executive editor Emma Ross Thomas explore the global implications of the growing oil and energy crisis. Watch the whole video at Bloomberg.com.
The Strait of Hormuz is important. Roughly 100 to 120 vessels cross this every day.
It's a very narrow waterway. It's only 21 miles wide. It's quite shallow as well. They can't actually close it without force. But what we've seen is that the violence and the threat of violence has kept ship owners away.
We've seen this result in extreme oil volatility over the last few days, even up to nearly $120 a barrel on the Brent global benchmark.
Back in February, the major Gulf producers were producing 20 million barrels per day. As of this week, our reporting shows that 6.7 million have been shut down.
This has immense downstream effects, primarily on fuel consumers, so airlines, chemicals, fertilizers, and then, of course, on the consumer, China, Japan, South Korea. The primary supply crunch will be felt within Asia.
Where the rubber hits the road, the real shortages, rationing, panic, queues, that has all been happening so far in Asia.
There are very limited bypass options for crude oil and LNG outside of the Persian Gulf.
Watch that whole video on the video hub at Bloomberg.com and, of course, in the Bloomberg terminal as well.
And a lot of other little mini docs. Our reporting folks have been really outdoing themselves and trying to make that accessible to everyone in a really watchable, readable way.
Fascinating conversation we just had there with Karen Young and with Flavia Krauss-Jackson. We didn't get to talk about Lebanon, but that's still, for me, front of mind as we talk about that widening gap between perhaps U.S. and Israeli objectives. And we can talk about that with Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Defense Committee
and Mike Lawler when they come up. It's interesting to me how little we've heard from the White House on that conflict, and it's unclear to which extent they endorse or if Israel even cares if the U.S. is on board, because this is something that's been part of their objective for quite some time now.
That coming up here in just a few minutes on Bloomberg This Weekend, which, of course, you can watch on Bloomberg Television. You can listen to it on Bloomberg Radio. You can stream the show at Bloomberg.com on the terminal or on the Bloomberg Business app. Much more to come here on Bloomberg This Weekend, live.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of your top stories. And surging gas prices following the conflict in the Middle East, well, that's forcing some drivers to rethink getting electric vehicles once again. Yeah, these are some new search results. It shows that electric vehicles, search for electric vehicles, up 20% in the week following the initial attack on Iran. Now, that's compared with 20% in the prior week. That's also according to CarEdge. And CarEdge is an AI-driven platform that helps car shoppers negotiate with dealerships. Drivers also searching for more hybrid vehicles. I'm on board with that. In sports, Swedish superstar Ludvig Åberg entering today's final round of the Players' Championship in Florida at the top of the leaderboard. Now, he's hoping to become the first player since Rory McIlroy in 2019 to lead at the 36-hole mark at the competition and go on to win. Tonight, a big matchup. Team USA taking on the Dominican Republic in the World Baseball Classic semifinals in Miami. Now, the U.S. had advanced to the semis with a close 5-3 win over Canada on Friday. The DR, though, they mercy ruled Korea with a 10-0 beatdown in 7 innings. David and Christina, I've been on that side of when it's a 10-0 thing, and it's not very fun. It's
the mercy rule is critical.
Yes.
I'm all in favor of it. Something that we have in Little League. Glad to see that on the global stage.
Little League?
Absolutely. Those poor kids, Christina. You have to have some mercy for those who are
watching little kids lose
mismatched.
Little League is just the most heartbreaking thing. I used to go to my brother's games, and it's just so sad.
And yet, a part of life. All right, Lisa, thank you very much for those headlines. Appreciate that. Well, for Iranians across the globe, the U.S. and Israeli attacks that led to the death of the supreme leader who ruled that country with an iron fist for nearly 4 decades brought unprecedented joy and uncertainty as they grappled with the reality of a teetering regime and President Trump's call to action to overthrow the government.
Iran never considered that it should lay down its weapons and just give in and arrive at peace with Israel and the U.S. It has been determined to fight. And that's probably the folly or the consequence of the strategy Ayatollah Khamenei and Khomeini pursued. This idea that the United States is a threat to Iran, the United States wants to take our sovereignty, we have to keep the U.S. out of Iran and, in fact, kick it out of the Middle East. And this has proven extremely costly to them. And now this is the final battle. This is where we've ended up.
The final battle? As in, it is existential then for the Iranian regime, you think, one way or another?
Yes. In fact, they call this the final battle. In other words, either we go down or that cordon gets broken. They very well understand that this 47 years of resistance to the United States is no longer sustainable in the way that it was waged. Iran is dying economically. It's continuously attacked by Israel and the United States now on its own soil since the collapse of Hezbollah in Syria. And so this is the final stand, that either they go down, either resistance collapses or resistance manages to change the rules of the game. And that's what they're betting on.
That was Vali Nasser speaking with our own Michelle Hussein. Joining us now is Dr. Mehrzad Boroujerdi, author of Iranian Intellectuals in the West and co-author of Post-Revolutionary Iran, A Political Handbook. He also serves as the Vice Provost and Dean of College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The first thing I do want to get into your family history, which is fascinating, but the first thing I want to ask you is President Trump and other leaders have called for a popular uprising in Tehran against this regime. That hasn't happened. Why do you think that is?
Right. I think there is no doubt that we are dealing with a rather unpopular regime in Iran. We have seen it in successive waves of social movements. In 2009, in the Women Life Freedom Movement, and then in the uprising last month that was really brutally put down by the regime. But the scales are still in favor of the state. They have a monopoly over means of violence, and they have shown that when they are threatened and feel that, that they have their existence is in danger, they are not shy about using, utmost force to put down the opposition. So at this time, we are witnessing a rather interesting situation. A lot of Iranians have put their hopes that this aerial bombardment by U.S. and Israel might finally tip the scale in their favor. But at least so far, the regime has shown itself to be much more resilient than I think, Washington and Tel Aviv perhaps expected it to be.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, yes, of course, they are afraid and their security concerns, but are they also pessimistic, given previous movements in Iran, that the regime will change, that their impact, if they were to take to the streets, would really have any difference?
Well, again, it depends on whether, how will this war end, right? So if we end up with a tormented yet triumphant regime, then the question confronting that regime is, okay, what am I going to do with my own public, right? Keep in mind, they have, I think, two ways in front of them, two paths. One is to really increase the level of suppression, basically go after any of their opponents and, call them the fifth column of the enemy and so forth. The other one is to really rethink how they have dealt with this public for so long. Iran's economy is already in ruins, even before this war, started. And now it's even in a worse shape. The challenge really, however, as far as I see it, is that this is a regime that is capable of injecting pain into its own population. Therefore, in my view, it has a higher threshold of pain compared to the other side, where President Trump has to worry about prices in the global market and so forth.
I'm curious sort of how you think about this playing out. If you think that the president has clearly enough called for a change in regime, and he often invokes what happened in Venezuela in the run-up to this conflict, where yes, he did spirit away the president of that country to face trial here in the United States, but largely that country's political apparatus remains unchanged. It's not as though there's been sort of whole-scale change in the way that country is run. As he keeps citing that as a model or an exemplar of what could happen in Iran, what are you thinking? What more do you think the American president should be doing at this moment in time?
Well, frankly, I think President Trump has not been disciplined enough in terms of the message he has been sending to the Iranians. Of course, emboldened by what happened in Venezuela, he keeps mentioning that as a model. But look, almost we are into the week 3 of this conflict, and yet there has been no serious defection among the Iranian political elite. So that's not happening. We are not seeing, a coup, for example, being organized and so forth. And so when President Trump says this is a little excursion, that the war is already almost over and we can agree to things, I think, he's sending conflicting signals to the public.
Before we let you go, I do want to ask you about your father. Your father was a prominent Iranian engineer who was killed alongside U.S. oil executive Paul Graham in 1978. When announcing the strike, the president went through a laundry list of deaths he said had occurred at the hands of these regimes and kind of used them as a justification for that attack. I'm wondering how you felt about that and if you think that that was a correct course of action or if you would have liked to see the U.S. address this in a different way.
Frankly, my approach personally, despite what has happened to my father, is that my message is no to the Islamic Republic and no to war, because I think this war is not going to produce the intended results. And as I already mentioned, I think we might end up with a regime that is going to be wounded and even more brutal, more securitized, more militarized in terms of how it deals with its own public. I much prefer that it be an internal struggle among the Iranians. All the public opinion polls that we get indicates that some 80% of the public is opposed to this regime, right? So I think it's really a matter of time. And of course, after this war, if they survive, they are going to be much more weakened. So I much rather this be a decision that is made by the Iranian public rather than outside forces.
Professor Mehrzad Boroujerdi, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your perspective this morning. All right, still ahead this Sunday, our live interviews with 2 members of Congress with important committee roles in this war, Democratic Congressman Adam Smith and Republican Congressman Mike Lawler.
And of course, on this Sunday, we were talking about Selection Sunday. It's, of course, Hollywood's biggest night as well, just hours away. Who will take home the Oscar Gold, those statuettes being arrayed in Los Angeles?
Have you seen any of these Best Picture contenders?
I have not, but let's not hold that against me and consider my cultural consumption lame here compared to yours and everyone else's here on set. But anyways, I have followed and read the stories about it and do intend to watch some movies.
Honestly, I moved. I started a new job. I'm very behind on my movies. Maybe we'll have a Bloomberg.
It's aspirational. The Oscars are always aspirational
Bloomberg This Weekend movie night. It'll be great.
Our own Lisa Mateo has a preview with Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, which, of course, you can watch on Bloomberg Television, listen to on Bloomberg Radio, and stream at Bloomberg.com on the terminal and on the Bloomberg Business app. Lisa, Christina, and I will be back in just a moment here on Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. Well, tonight, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, they're going to be handing out their highest honor to films and filmmakers. So who's going to take home the Oscar Gold, and will people be watching in this era of streaming? Here to break it all down for us is Lucas Shaw. He is managing editor, media and entertainment at Bloomberg News, also the author of the Screen Time newsletter. Lucas, thanks for joining us. Before we get into the nominations, I want to kind of set the scene with the show itself. I mean, it seems like, audiences have been dropping off or moving from broadcast TV and streaming to strictly streaming in 2029. And then you have, a time of layoffs, geopolitical tension. But at the same time, you have Oscar betting predictions at an all-time high. So all that said, will more people be watching? Where are they watching? And what does it mean for the future of the show?
Well, big picture, the audience for the Oscars has gone down considerably from its peak. You look at the number of people who watched it in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I believe that the year that Titanic won was the high water mark. You used to have north of 30, 40 million people who'd watch it. Now it's closer to about 20 million. I think that being said, the Oscars is still one of the most watched broadcasts. Basically, it's after football on all of television. It always ranks among the 50, 100 most watched telecasts broadcasts on TV any given year. You know, it's suffered some in relevance because it used to be one of the only places people could kind of see all the celebrities in one place. Now you can follow all these people on social media. Movies used to be more important and central to culture than they used to be. But I think the audience for this year's show will probably be pretty good. You know, you've got the two contenders, One Battle After Another and Sinners, are both very popular movies, or at least reasonably popular movies. You've got a lot of big names, young talent, Timothée Chalamet, Michael B. Jordan. But the long-term trajectory has obviously been down, which is one of the reasons why they did a deal with YouTube to try to kind of bring in some fresh blood.
All right, let's get into the movies themselves. So this year, 6 movies secured more than half of all nominations. Now, that's with a bigger picture list. That's also with a new category in there. So why are fewer movies competing?
I mean, so I tried to answer this because I wrote about this for my newsletter a little bit ago. The best answer I could come up with is the major studios are making fewer movies that are, you know, your classic Oscar movies, your dramas, basically. Adult dramas used to be one of the 3 or 4 biggest genres in movies. It's slipped down. They've all defaulted to making fewer movies, and those movies that they do make tend to be bigger action-adventure type movies that can travel globally. And so when studios do make a movie like One Battle After Another, everyone gets behind it. I also think there's probably a little bit of groupthink now. We sort of just anoint a couple of movies the movies of Oscar season, and then all the voters just nominate that movie in every category.
All right, so let's get to the nominations. We'll start with Best Picture, 10 in this one. Okay, so we have Sinners, Frankenstein, One Battle After Another, Hamnet, Marty Supreme, Train Dreams, Sentimental Value, The Secret Agent, Bugonia, and F1. Okay, so from that list, who do you think is going to win, or maybe who you think should win?
Well, One Battle After Another is the runaway favorite. It's won just about every major award. It didn't win Best Cast at the SAG Awards. Sinners won that, but it won the Producers Award, the Directors Award. It's won all the Critics Awards. And so I think that is seen as the heavy favorite, and if it lost, people would be very surprised. Sinners is the only movie that people think has a real shot at an upset. It has the most nominations of any movie in Oscar history. It was a widely popular movie. The director of it, Ryan Coogler, is well regarded. The star of it, Michael B. Jordan, is someone people really like. So I still think One Battle wins, but I wouldn't be surprised if Sinners did. You know, what should is entirely subjective. I tend to think that the Oscar should go to the movie that people will really remember and talk about 5-10 years down the line. And I think there's a movie of these nominees that is kind of most significant. It's probably Sinners. And on a personal level, I would probably pick Sinners or Marty Supreme over One Battle, but who cares what I think?
We all do, Lucas. All right, let's get to Best Actor. Okay, so Timothée Chalamet, Marty Supreme, Leonardo DiCaprio, One Battle After Another, Ethan Hawke, Blue Moon, Michael B. Jordan, Sinners, Wagner Moura, The Secret Agent. Who is going to take it home?
You know, this has become a really big talking point or question the last couple of weeks. For most of the season, Timothée Chalamet looked like the runaway favorite. He was winning all the prizes, giving all the speeches. He'd run a really kind of smart campaign to not just go for awards, but to promote the movie, which became a pretty big hit for a period piece about a ping pong player. Michael B. Jordan has gained a lot of momentum over the last couple of weeks and is now seen by many as the favorite. And so it's likely a toss-up between those two with, I guess Leo DiCaprio or Wagner Moura as like real dark horses. But it's going to come down to Timmy and Michael B.
All right, let's quickly get to Best Actress. So we have Jessie Buckley for Hamnet, Rose Byrne, If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, Kate Hudson, Song Sung Blue, Renata Reinseva for Sentimental Value, Emma Stone, Bugonia. So who is your pick for Best Actress?
This is seen as probably the biggest slam dunk of all the nominees. Jessie Buckley has won everything, is going to win this, and this is one where I'm not a gambler, but if you wanted to bet money, this would be the one to bet money on. You just might not get a lot back when you win.
All right, and a lot of people are betting money on this. Thank you, Lucas Shaw, so much. If you too want to be in the know for the latest in entertainment news, sign up for his Screen Time newsletter. All you have to do is go to Bloomberg.com/newsletters. David and Christina.
All right, thanks, Lisa. We know you are rooting for Sinners over there.
You got to sign up for that newsletter.
Exactly.
It's very
and then
good.
You'll know.
It's very good.
All right, we're coming up on our 9 a.m. hour in New York. Ahead in our politics hour, we're going to speak live with Democratic Congressman Adam Smith. He's the ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, as well as Republican Congressman Mike Lawler, who serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Bloomberg This Weekend continues right now. Today on Bloomberg This Weekend, President Trump tells NBC News that Iran is ready for a ceasefire, but he's not ready to make a deal. And we're learning the names of the 6 American troops killed in the plane crash in Iraq.
And the White House is calling on other countries to help secure the Strait of Hormuz as oil prices climb. President Trump says gas prices will go lower than they were before the war.
Plus, Ukraine says Iran is using Russia's help to target Americans.
I have 100% facts the day that the Iranian regime used against American bases and against our Middle East.
But President Trump says he doesn't need their help. We're talking to congressmen from both sides of the aisle about what's next in the fight.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, March 15th. And this hour, we want to talk about some of the reaction at home, because obviously all politics are local, always, even in global conflicts. And opinion polls, public opinion matters in this country, although it does not matter, as one of our analysts was just pointing out, in countries like Iran. But here, leaders do try to hold, leaders are held accountable by the public, and that's something we want to talk to members of both parties about, what they're hearing from their constituents as we see these price spikes, and whether they understand what the objective is for the U.S. and Iran.
Dovetailing that, of course, with the latest developments out of the Middle East, and there has been more fighting overnight. Of course, we saw a prominent oil port in the UAE hit by a drone strike. We saw Saudi Arabia intercepting 10 drones near Riyadh, Bahrain sounding sirens urging residents to take shelter. So this conflict continuing to widen geographically, even as the president raises the specter of an endgame in a conversation with NBC News. We'll surely talk about that with those two congressmen as well. But first, let's get a check of the headlines on this Sunday morning with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
And let's start with President Trump. He says that Iran is ready to negotiate a deal, but he's not ready to make a deal. And this was that 30-minute phone interview with NBC News. The president said terms aren't good enough yet. He did not say what those terms were. Now, Trump also dismissed concerns about rising gas prices and also questioned whether Iran's new supreme leader is even alive. Now, at the same time, the president ramping up the pressure on Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, calling on countries to send warships to help commercial vessels pass through safely. In a social media post, the president gave little detail beyond saying he hoped that China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK would all pitch in. And in another post, the president added that the U.S. will provide help for those nations which take care of that passage. Now, Iran's foreign minister responded saying that the strait was only shut to ships from enemies. Now, about a fifth of the world's oil supplies normally flow through Hormuz. Now, this all comes as the President Trump ordered strikes on military sites on Kharg Island, from which Iran exports almost all of its oil. According to tolls from government, non-governmental organizations, roughly 3,750 people have been killed across the region since the war began February 28th. Speaking from Beirut, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an immediate end to hostilities, also a stop to the Israeli bombing in Lebanon and rocket fire by Hezbollah.
We are doing everything we can now to bring about an immediate de-escalation and the cessation of hostility. My special coordinator is engaging with all actors around the clock to bring the parties to the table.
And happening today, U.S. and China trade talks underway in Paris. Taking part in negotiations, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and China's Vice Premier Li Feng. They're expected to review the latest developments in a truce reached in November, but also to talk about the war in Iran, as well as investment and purchases. So David and Christina, it's kind of opening the curtain to what lies ahead at the end of the month when President Trump heads to China.
Lisa, thank you very much. Lisa Mateo there with those headlines. And I mentioned that interview that President Trump did with NBC News, and coming out of that, he said we, quote, totally demolished Kharg Island, that island off the coast of Iran, so important to that country's oil industry. But we may hit it a few more times just for fun, he continued in that interview, and talked about the prospects of there being a deal between the U.S. and Iran, saying that Iran has offered one, but it's not acceptable to the U.S. side. We're going to talk about all of this with two congressmen. First, Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Mike Lawler is going to join us after that conversation with Representative Smith. He is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Smith, great to have you with us, of course, representing the 9th District in the state of Washington. I want to start with that comment that I just read, that comment that the president made to NBC News, saying that on the heels of hitting Kharg Island, he might do it a few more times just for fun. And I wonder how that resonates with you as you think about what the end game is here and what you've learned from the administration about how they intend to prosecute this war to its conclusion.
Well, certainly the cavalier, non-serious way in which President Trump, Secretary Hegseth, and others have talked about this war. We had Secretary Hegseth talking about no quarter, which is basically a military term for no survivors, kill everybody. I think that attitude has really undermined our ability to build support and move forward. It's far from the largest problem with this war. I mean, the largest problem is, what's the plan? What's the strategy? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the path to achieving it? And how do we deal with the costs that are mounting by the day, certainly in terms of deaths, but the economic impact you referenced globally? What's the path here? I know we want to degrade Iran's capability militarily, but how much? And then the real goal at the start of this seemed to be to fundamentally change Iran's calculus, to make them less hostile to us, to Israel, and to the region. And there seems to be no progress on that aspect of the plan. So this war is continuing. The cost is incredibly high. The president doesn't seem to have a plan. Meanwhile, they want to apparently try to convince America that this is some kind of fun video game that we're just playing, even as people are dying all across the region, and the global economy is suffering from this. So yeah, I wish they were a little more serious in the way they explained such an incredibly important action that they are taking.
Congressman, I want to get to what you know about the mission and the administration's sense of that mission. And we saw the news that the administration plans to send the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit to the region to add to the number of service personnel who are there in the Middle East. Do you have a clear understanding of what those Marines are going to do? And as you watch that unfold, what does it tell you about the direction of this conflict?
Yeah, I have a clear understanding of what the options are. And look, we've been talking about this for a long time. There is no doubt that Iran is a major problem in the region, in the world, a threat to us, a threat to Israel. They support a variety of different violent extremist terrorist groups. How do you deal with that threat? So the Armed Services Committee for years now has been looking at options. I mean, what can you do? What's militarily on the table? And there's always been two big problems with the military option. One, the collateral damage. You hit Iran, it spreads, and that's certainly happened. It spread as far as anyone would have feared. Second problem is, can you really degrade them militarily to such a degree that it makes that cost worth the effort? And what we learned is really not, because the Iranian regime is dug in. They are very, very solid. Even as their leaders have been killed, they have a succession plan. There's 90 million people in Iran. They have a military. They do not appear inclined to simply collapse. So the conclusion was the military option wouldn't accomplish those objectives, would blow up the region, cause all manner of collateral damage and escalation, and wouldn't ultimately accomplish the objective. Trump decided to walk into that. And to think that, A, we can degrade their military capability to such a degree that it makes it worth it. But if they can just rebuild it, I mean, that's the main problem with that. And then second, he seemed to just sort of cross his fingers and say, well, gosh, if we hit them hard enough, they'll either collapse or they will simply be broken enough to do what we want. But there was never a clear path between all of this bombing and all of this destruction and getting to that change in behavior by Iran. That's the problem, and that's what we're experiencing right now. And I'd be interested to hear anyone who supports this war tell me what that path is at this point to fundamentally breaking and changing the regime. I don't see it.
Do you think that goal is accomplishable without putting boots on the ground? One of the experts we spoke to this week said there are two ways to go about this. You know, you can do a prolonged bombing campaign, but that doesn't give you as much input and impetus into what's actually happening on the ground and could take longer, or you can send in troops, but then again, you could get mired in another forever war.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. I didn't directly answer the most important part of that previous question. And so we've done this bombing campaign, and you want to try to do it on the cheap, and that's what a bombing campaign is. Now, we've seen even the bombing campaign spreads, escalates, causes violence across the region. But now you're up against that reality of, okay, you haven't achieved the objective. What about ground troops? And the problem with ground troops, again, is you're going to need a lot to dislodge this regime. There are talk about, more tactical efforts, smaller numbers of troops, and this is what the Marines could do. One possibility is you seize Kharg Island to try to cut off that economic lifeline for Iran. But could you seize it? Could you hold it? There's considerable questions about that. Maybe a small group of special forces can help spark a revolt within Iran. But again, there's no clear path to that.
But would you support that? Would you support U.S. troops going in a limited capacity like that?
Heavens no. No, sorry, I do not. Because I don't think it would be effective. And I think it, again, would be an escalation. It would cost more lives. And I don't think you'd be able to dislodge regime. And that's the problem. And let me be clear. If I woke up tomorrow and this Iranian regime was gone and we had an Iran that was working for the Iranian people and stopped all of the terrible stuff they were doing, I would be very, very happy. But the problem is there's no direct path to doing that. And the cost of what Donald Trump has done without thinking that through, without having a plan to actually achieve the objective. So now you can't achieve the objective, and you've caused an enormous amount of casualties, disruption, and escalation, not just in Iran, but across the region and across the world. So that's the problem I have with this approach.
I want to ask you about the path forward here for lawmakers like yourself who oppose this military action. So we saw that vote on the War Powers Resolution fail in both houses last week. How do you pick up the pieces from that? What does opposition to this war look like going forward, both in the House and the Senate, as you see it?
Yeah, well, certainly we need to speak out against it. And for those who are against the war, give them a voice, give them an argument for why to do it. But I think from a practical standpoint, my goal is to stop the war because I think it's bad. I think it's bad policy. It's escalation. It's incredibly costly. It's devastating to our economy. We've seen gas prices go up, 50 cents to a dollar. It's going to cause the affordability crisis to only get worse in this country. And I think the most sensible path to that is try to encourage the Trump administration and the supporters of this war to, however implausibly, be able to declare victory and stop. Okay, try to begin to rebuild pieces. That, I think, is a plausible argument for the Trump administration. And then you hear Trump saying, let's bomb them for fun. You hear Hegseth saying no quarter. You hear Trump saying they're willing to negotiate, but I'm not really in the mood. All of that is deep cause for concern. But the plan is, okay, declare victory and stop. If that can stop the war, then I'm more than willing to make that argument.
Do you have any kind of read on the condition of the new leader of Iran? Because we have this statement from Iran's foreign minister saying Moshtaba Khamenei is in good health and fully managing the situation, but we still haven't seen him. What is your perspective, and what are you hearing about whether he is, in fact, even a player at this point?
I have no idea. Nobody knows. All right. So there is no answer to that question. I think the thing is, let's not get too excited about what the answer is to that one way or the other. Even if he is, as some host told me the other day, he's in a coma and he's missing a limb. How he knows that, I have no idea. But let's say that the guy's completely incapacitated and he dies in a week. The statement that was put out, if it wasn't put out by him, it was put out by the Iranian regime. It was put out by the people who are in charge of Iran. So the belligerence in that statement, the complete lack of any sort of acquiescence, as Trump had hoped, shows that whether this guy's alive or not, the people who are running Iran are no closer to having a reasonable government there than they were at the start of this war. Arguably, they're further away and even more dug in.
Last question I have is just about money. And before this war began, you had a Pentagon asking for an extremely large budget, $1.5 trillion, which I think will astonish a lot of people. I imagine some of your constituents as well. Is this administration going to get that from Congress? What's your assessment of the appetite to increase the defense budget to that size and scale?
Yeah, that's a 50% increase in the defense budget. And by the way, that doesn't include the supplemental that they're talking about asking for to help cover the costs of this war, which is going to be in the tens of billions of dollars. No, that's not realistic. And look, we have a $38 trillion debt. And it's very frustrating to me that everyone talks about that. And then, oh my gosh, the Republicans, when they came riding into majority in Congress and President Trump got elected, this was a major issue. And then they voted for the reconciliation bill to add $4 trillion to the debt by massively cutting taxes. You're going to massively cut taxes, and then you're going to start a war and ask for a 50% increase in the defense budget. I mean, I don't think we need to do that, even if we hadn't cut those taxes. But my God, how do you stand up in front of the American people and say, we need a $1.5 trillion defense budget? We had to go to this war and spend these $10 billion, but we're not going to pay for it. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to drive the debt through the ceiling. I'm a little bit speechless in terms of how do you justify that from any sort of economic standpoint. I wouldn't have cut the taxes, and I wouldn't be going to war and massively increasing the defense budget. But to try to do both is just insane, in my view.
Gentleman from the 9th Congressional District in Washington, Congressman Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Thank you very much for your time on this Sunday. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We want to go now to the other side of the aisle and the other side of the country and talk to Congressman Mike Lawler, a Republican from the great state of New York, and he serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, I think you were listening when your Democratic colleague said he wishes they, meaning this administration, were a little more serious about all this. Do you agree or disagree with that? And I just want to give you a chance to react to anything else you heard your colleague say.
Well, I wish my Democratic colleagues were more serious about this. I mean, the fact is 53 of them voted last week not to declare Iran the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. So I think my colleague should be a little more focused on, frankly, the unseriousness of his own party. And frankly, nothing he said was actually of substance in that interview that I just listened to. The fact is that everybody acknowledges, other than the 53 Democrats that voted no, that Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terror. They have been the greatest impediment to peace and stability in the Middle East and in the region. We see with their belligerent response to this conflict, where they are striking civilian sites in Arab states neighboring them, that Iran is the real threat here. And ultimately, after months of negotiation in which Iran refused to cede any ground with respect to its ballistic missiles program and its financing of terrorism, President Trump made a decision that every president said that they would ensure that Iran never got a nuclear weapon. And between last summer's strikes and the decision to take military action here, President Trump is ensuring that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That is paramount. And all of my Democratic colleagues, including Adam Smith, just said, oh, I hope it works out. I hope we get regime change. I hope. Well, hope is not a strategy. And you actually have to be willing to take action. And that is the fundamental problem, and why Barack Obama's attempts at this and Joe Biden's attempts at this have failed so miserably, because hope is not a strategy. You actually have to be willing to take military action if you are going to impede their ability to use a nuclear weapon. The problem here was very simple. Iran was mass producing ballistic missiles at such a rate that if we did not intervene, if we did not stop it, they would have been able to develop a nuclear bomb and utilize it in short time frame.
But Congressman, I haven't seen any evidence that shows that that breakout time was closer or more urgent this week, this month, than it was last summer when the administration went after those nuclear sites. Do you have any information that those decimated nuclear sites, according to this administration, were all of a sudden a bigger threat? Yeah.
Okay, we have had classified briefs, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of the classified briefs, but the fact is that the administration and President Trump took decisive action last summer, striking 3 nuclear facilities. As everybody understands, Iran has enriched uranium that they are currently storing, and they were mass producing ballistic missiles at an alarming rate that would actually protect their ability to develop that bomb. Had we waited, had we allowed this to continue in perpetuity, it would have been almost impossible for us to take the necessary steps to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon.
Congressman.
So there was a decision that was made, and I support what the president decided in this moment to end the threat of a nuclear Iran. And for many of my colleagues on the Democratic side, the problem with them is they're inconsistent on everything. Adam Smith was in support of efforts in Libya to remove Muammar Gaddafi. Adam Smith was supportive of Barack Obama's 7-month bombing of Libya. Didn't say boo about it. So the problem is many of my Democratic colleagues care more about the fact that Donald Trump is president and it's Donald Trump making these decisions than they do preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And that's the fundamental problem.
Congress, you said just a moment ago that hope is not a strategy. I'm going to quote from something that the president said to NBC News yesterday. Quote, hopefully, China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK and others that are affected by this artificial constraint will send ships to the area so that the Hormuz Strait will no longer be a threat by a nation that has been totally decapitated. Therein, it does seem like hope is the strategy for the president. As we look at the strait totally closed to traffic, explain how it's anyhow different.
The president is in touch with these nations. Remember, China is the greatest purchaser of Iranian petroleum.
And yet, where are they? The strait remains closed, and we see energy coming to a standstill.
If you'd like me to finish, let me actually speak. Thanks. So the fact is, China is the greatest purchaser of Iranian petroleum. They're the ones that benefit most from the Strait of Hormuz being open. So, yeah, it's in China's interest. It's in some of our European allies' interest for the Strait of Hormuz to be open. Remember, we don't get oil from Iran. We have crippling sanctions on Iranian petroleum. Iran's illicit oil trade is what has funded terrorism around the globe, and we have been cracking down on that. Last Congress, I passed the SHIP Act alongside Secretary Rubio when he was in the Senate to crack down on the illicit oil trade. Obviously, we want the Strait of Hormuz to be open. That is why the president has taken aggressive action against Iran's naval fleet, obliterating it, as well as going after their military capacity and capability on Kharg Island. So we are taking necessary measures to push back against the Iranian regime and their efforts to block the Strait of Hormuz. But it is also incumbent on some of our allies and adversaries, many of whom benefit from trade coming through the Strait of Hormuz, to engage. And I think the president is not only engaged in that conversation, but he's making the point that it is in their best interest as well to engage on this matter.
Congressman, I want to ask you about the cost of this conflict, not just the financial cost, but also the human toll. There has been a lot of loss of life, including American soldiers, and one of them, I believe, is from your district. There's an NYPD officer who died in Kuwait supporting this operation. What are you hearing from your constituents? Have you spoken to this family? And are people concerned that as this goes on, even if they support the president, even if they support the objectives, they may not be willing to commit more American lives to this operation?
Well, anytime we have military engagement, the loss of life is tragic. The loss of our men and women in our armed forces is tragic, and our heart breaks for their families. I have spoken to his widow, and we will certainly be doing everything in our power to support the family. There is a GoFundMe that has already raised well over $100,000 to support this family, including a $100,000 donation by Bill Ackman, and I thank him for that in support of this family. But this is obviously always a very difficult time. Anytime you have the loss of our soldiers. We saw the refueling airplane the other day go down, and 6 soldiers lost in that. It's tragic, and certainly that is something that the military does everything in their power to guard against and prevent the loss of life. But this is certainly a conflict in which we are trying to stop evil. We are trying to prevent a nuclear weapon from being used in the Middle East or around the globe and cause mass casualty. You see how Iran has responded, belligerently striking civilian targets in neighboring Arab states. They launched hundreds of ballistic missiles at Israel last year and the year before. The fact is, this regime needs to be defeated, and President Trump and our armed forces are making a necessary, difficult, but necessary decision to take out the threat.
Congressman, I want to ask you lastly, you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, as we mentioned, but you're on the Financial Services Committee as well. And we had this news on Friday that a judge had struck down what the U.S. Attorney in D.C. hoped to do, which is to issue subpoenas, or get information from Fed Chair Jerome Powell and from the Federal Reserve as well, vis-a-vis his chairmanship. We heard from Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who's threatened to withhold Fed nominations as a result of that investigation, that he continues to do so in light of what's happened here. Do you think it's in our interest, in the country's interest, for these investigations to continue if it does involve holding up the nomination of Kevin Warsh to be the next Fed chair?
Look, I'd like to see Kevin Warsh confirmed expeditiously. I think it's imperative that he come in as chairman. Jerome Powell will still be on the Fed board. But from my vantage point, I don't think this is the best use of time and resources. I've said that previously. Should there be an investigation into how, the rebuilding of the Federal Reserve building went billions of dollars over budget? Sure. And they should get to the bottom of that and have a full understanding of that. But I don't think that at this moment requires a criminal investigation of Chairman Powell. And I think, frankly, we need to move forward with a new Fed chair.
Congressman Mike Lawler, thank you so much for joining us. A mutual friend tells me you're a big Oscar fan, so I hope you get a chance to relax and watch that tonight. Maybe we can have you back and talk about your picks and whether you got them or not.
I assure you I will not be watching this.
Sorry about the audio there. All right, well, Congressman, I will report back to your friend, and I will out him to you on a separate chain.
There we go.
Thank
All right,
you so
we're going
much.
to talk a bit more about the conversation we've just been having, politics more broadly, with Eric Cortellessa. He's a senior political correspondent for Time Magazine. McKay Coppins joins us as well, a staff writer at The Atlantic Magazine. And McKay, let me start with you. I think what we're seeing there in stark relief in the conversations that we had with those two representatives back to back is this disagreement about objectives, about the American public's appetite for this war. And I'm curious how you're framing that or thinking about that as we enter the third week of this conflict. We see in public opinion polls the relative unpopularity of this war. How do you see it sort of framing or focusing politicians' attentions heading to the midterms?
Yeah, I think President Trump's Republican allies are at a disadvantage here because, in part, the administration has been so unclear about what its objectives are, right? Its messaging from the very beginning, and this started with President Trump giving a series of one-on-one interviews to reporters in the immediate aftermath of the strikes in Iran, kind of saying very different and often contradictory things. What's happened over and over again is that the administration has laid out different ideas for how this is going to go, for how long it will last, for what they hope to accomplish. And the bigger issue, I think, is that Donald Trump, in kind of launching these strikes, went against one of the core articles of faith of the MAGA movement, right? One of his keenest political insights when he first started running for president was that America was exhausted by war, that there was space in the Republican Party for an anti-war, anti-interventionist president. And that's how he won the Republican primary. It's how he ran for president all three times. And in going into Iran the way he has, and in leaving it kind of open-ended in terms of how long these strikes will last, how long this conflict will last, it really does create a lot of dissonance for Republicans who had gotten on board with that message, now trying to explain why this conflict is okay and how this still is in keeping with his broader anti-interventionist message.
Eric, I want to go to you because there's been some chatter this week about who has the president's cell phone number and who does not. But you do have a recent interview with the president in your piece from the 5th in which you say, asked whether Americans should be worried about retaliatory attacks at home, Trump acknowledges the possibility. I guess, he says, but I don't think they're worried about that all the time. Excuse me. I think they're worried about that all the time. We think about that all the time. We plan for it. But yeah, we expect some things. Like I said, some people will die. When you go to war, some people will die. Do you think that's an outcome, even though the president and the White House may be okay with it, the American people can really get their heads around?
No, I don't. I think that's, the number one obligation of a president, of a commander in chief, to keep the American people safe. Obviously, an attack on the homeland would be deeply unnerving to the American public. I think one thing, my takeaway when I heard President Trump make that argument, as well as the other argument he made to me and others, which is that he sensed that the Iranians were going to attack America or American and Israeli assets first was that he really wants to get ahead of the argument that he has waged a war of choice and not a war of self-defense. He wants to frame this as a war of self-defense because, as McKay just said, when he launched this war, he betrayed one of the core pillars of sort of MAGA ideology. It's been from the beginning of his political rise in 2015, protectionist on trade, restrictionist on immigration, and an aversion to entanglements overseas. So I think one thing that President Trump really wants to do as he tries to make the case for the war, especially given the initial rollout being such a mess with all these competing and contradictory explanations from him and his other cabinet level and administration officials, is to make the American people feel like this is a war that we had no choice to get into, because if we didn't, the Iranians were going to inflict pain on Americans.
McKay, I want to ask you about the plasticity of that argument as we've seen it evolve over these last couple of weeks. And as we've discussed, the president's had these one-on-one interviews with reporters, but there's been no grand speech to the American people from the Oval Office, for instance. He hasn't really made a crystal clear case for going to war. And we've seen the motivations kind of evolve and change over the course of these last few weeks, as he's articulated them and members of his administration have as well. Where do you think all of that is heading? And it does seem sort of out of keeping with the way that he has messaged in the past. And does that suggest to you that there's inherent difficulty on his part in kind of coming up with a cohesive message, a cohesive rationale for the fight that's underway?
Yeah, I think, one thing about this president is that, to put it uncharitably, and I've heard people in his own administration say this, he's always the victim of his last conversation. And in this particular case, conflict with Iran, war with Iran, is an incredibly divisive issue. There are people in his White House who are dead set and have been for a very long time on toppling this regime. There are people in his White House who are dead set against getting into a foreign entanglement. And so part of the narrative confusion, the messaging confusion, is probably the fact that he's hearing from a lot of different voices who disagree, and he's struggling to come up with a cohesive message. But I just have to go back to this idea that he's kind of preparing the nation for the possibility of terrorist attacks or strikes on the homeland. I mean, I do think that would be probably, politically speaking, the end of his presidency if that happened. I mean, it's hard to overstate how much this president has built his political brand around keeping the country safe, law and order, being tough on terror, tough on illegal immigration. If he was to allow something like that to happen during his presidency, and of course presidents don't have complete control over these things, I do not think the American public would be very forgiving, and I think his party would suffer the political consequences.
Eric, can you break down for us? This is the question that I have had: is who in the White House is supporting what? Because we know that Susie Wiles wanted the president to stay focused on the economy, on domestic politics ahead of this midterm. But there has to be another camp that is supportive of this intervention in Iran. Do we know where this is coming from? And again, address that issue of not only McKay's the victim of his last conversation, but I've also heard it phrased like object permanence. Whoever is in front of him in that moment is how he makes that decision. Do we know who got in front of him on Iran, or is this coming from the president himself? And are detractors in the White House having any success trying to pull him back towards a domestic agenda?
Well, his advisors are not having success in pulling him back on a domestic agenda. It's been reported, and I have also spoke to officials in the White House who have said that Susie Wiles in particular was very concerned about him launching these strikes on Iran, and especially got concerned as oil prices surged and the market has tumbled in the days and weeks since. I think, one dynamic you really saw in the first term that remains persistent in the second term, if you want to have influence in President Trump's White House, is you've got to be the last person to speak to him before he makes a decision. President Trump doesn't really make a decision until he actually makes the decision, until he's announced it on Truth Social. And in some cases, even then, he will backpedal. So it's always part of the dynamic of Trump, where you have all these different factions or different figures who are trying to be the last person to speak to him before he ultimately has to pull the trigger on a decision. I don't think there are as many people in this White House who are hawkish as there were in the first Trump term. Obviously, you had people like John Bolton and others who for whom it was a fever dream to finally try to decapitate this regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But in this particular White House, there aren't that many people who believe in this kind of aggressive military interventionist posture. The one person who has a history and who has been a supporter of President Trump undertaking these strikes in the background has been Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio was a more hawkish, sort of neoconservative coming into his political career when he joined the Senate. He has, of course, had to shift his posture as he's been kind of chameleon-like, trying to navigate staying in Trump's favor. And I think one really interesting dynamic to continue to follow as this plays out is the tension between him and J.D. Vance,
Yeah, we got to go.
who, of course, has been way more oppositional in private, trying to steer the president away from this. President Trump sort of let it slip this week and admitted that they had a different philosophical framework thinking about.
We got to leave it there, Eric, just for time. Eric Cortellessa, their political correspondent for Time Magazine, joining us alongside McKay, Coppins, and come back. He's with the Atlantic Magazine, has a new piece out, My Year as a Degenerate Gambler.
And coming up, a key Fed decision next week. We're going to talk about it all coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of our top stories. And oil loading operations, that at a key port in the United Arab Emirates, it has resumed. And that's after a drone strike and a fire forced exports to a halt. Sources telling Bloomberg operations at Fujairah have restarted. The port sits at the end of a pipeline, allowing the UAE to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it has capacity of more than 70 million barrels of oil, fuels for traders needing quick supply access. It also serves as a ship refueling hub. Fujairah caught fire on Saturday due to falling debris from an intercepted drone strike. FCC Chairman Brendan Carr, he has a warning for broadcasters that are covering the Iran war. He says correct course or risk losing your license. It was in a social media post. Now, Carr said, quote, broadcasters that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. Now, the warning was placed on top of a post from President Donald Trump, who was complaining about coverage in the Middle East conflict. And another setback in the turmoil that has rocked the global aluminum industry. Sent prices soaring during the war in the Middle East. Aluminum Bahrain, it's also known as Alba. It started a phased production shutdown at the world's largest single-site smelter of the metal. The suspension, well, it's going to allow the company to preserve its inventory of raw materials, also keep other parts of the plant operating as ship transit through that Strait of Hormuz is affected. And we all know about that. David and Christina.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Lisa. Welcome back. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. The Department of Justice says it will appeal a federal judge's ruling that rejected subpoenas tied to the investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
This comes as the nomination for Powell's replacement, Kevin Warsh, is stalled in Congress ahead of the next Fed interest rate decision, which will take place this week, that meeting concluding on Wednesday. A lot going on. I want to bring in Michael McKay, our international economics and policy correspondent. Bailey Lipschultz, Bloomberg senior reporter covering the markets, is back with us as well. Mike, let me go to you on this development that we got on Friday afternoon. I'm curious how it's kind of reverberated over the course of the weekend. We saw a very angry U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro on the heels of that judicial decision. How has the story changed or evolved as a result?
Well, it really hasn't changed much from the Fed's point of view. It changes from the White House's point of view because now they've gotten themselves in a situation where it could be even longer before they get Kevin Warsh confirmed, because Senator Tillis says he's going to maintain his hold on the nomination while this is out there. And U.S. Attorney Pirro says she's going to appeal it, which could, in theory, if you think about how the justice system works, go for months. But from the Fed's point of view, they never thought this was legal. They never thought that there was any real jeopardy to the chair, except that you never can tell when you get in front of a jury or something what might happen. So they've maintained that they're going to just follow their instincts on the economy and ignore this. And that's going to be what happens on Wednesday. There isn't much they can do about it at the moment, now that they have won their side of the case, except to follow up when there's an appeal. So look for them to not talk about this a whole lot. I imagine Jay Powell will be asked about it, but I don't think he's going to have a lot to say about it.
Bailey, I'm going to try to ask you a question that will get a slightly more optimistic answer than the last one that I asked you about a couple minutes ago. I'm going to give it a shot. Have markets changed their expectations of what's going to happen at this meeting going forward?
Not with this meeting in particular. The big question is, when is the next cut? Right now, we're seeing investors pricing in a better than 50-50 chance that that happens in September. But the ultimate fully priced in cut, when we look at some of the swaps data, has been moving out consistently since the war in Iran started. So uncertainty around what the ultimate impact is for the U.S. economy. If you look back a week ago, we had a fully priced in cut in September with expectations for 2 by December. 2 weeks ago, that number got even higher. But right now, we are continuing to see investors really digesting what this could ultimately mean and what it means for the Fed, because just all things considered, there's not an expectation that, assuming the calendar plays out as it should, Jay Powell will be at the helm when there's another cut.
And is it, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, picking up on your very good question, going to Mike here, there had been this expectation that we would have a Chairman Warsh at the meeting, not following this one, but the one after that his time was ending here. Jay Powell's time was ending. But with all of this uncertainty, Mike, we're looking at the prospect, very real prospect, that there could be a Fed Chair Jerome Powell for many more meetings to come.
Yes, absolutely. He would not be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board unless the Fed determined and voted to make him that, and it stood up in court because there's some legal arguments that the president could appoint a board chairman pro tem, but he would remain as chairman of the Open Market Committee, and that's the important thing. That's the group that sets interest rates. He was elected to be chairman for this entire year. They knew that there was a possibility he would be leaving in May, but they don't have to do anything. They'll just leave him in place, and so the president may be in a situation where he doesn't get a new chairman. Jay Powell is still in charge for quite some time to come. Now, I don't think Powell's going to be influenced by the president in terms of rates one way or another, but he is going to be influenced, as is everybody else on the committee, by what's happening in the war. And Bailey was talking about the idea of pricing out rate cuts. Nobody in the markets is really pricing in rate hikes, but if the war continues and inflation continues to rise and gets into other parts of the economy, that's something that people will have to consider. Rate cuts are still more likely, but they could appear even sooner if we get into a stagflationary situation where the economy starts to really slow because of what's happening with the war. So a lot of moving parts there for whoever is chairman going forward.
Bailey, you talked about how much there's uncertainty across markets, across industries right now. One of the other outliers is now this Fed decision. It seems like it was a fait accompli and this had been kind of resolved, and now you have this outstanding case. I'm going to play some DOJ sound about their decision to appeal the judge's decision on these federal subpoenas.
And so this decision today by Judge Boasberg runs directly afoul of our highest court's admonition that courts and judges must not and cannot saddle grand juries with mini trials and preliminary showings that impede a prosecutor's investigation and thus frustrate the public's interest in the fair and expeditious administration of justice. No one, folks, is above the law. And this outrageous decision will be appealed by the United States Department of Justice.
Bailey, if the Trump administration were trying to calm markets and create some certainty, would they just let this one go?
You would think so, especially just given the expectation that Mike had mentioned where, okay, there could be Fed Chair Warsh sooner than later, looking at that May time frame. As long as this drags on, as Mike was making the point, this becomes another question mark, another headache, if you will, for the policy that we've heard the White House be adamant about, which is lower rates sooner. And we've heard that from a number of folks kind of being inspired by President Donald Trump, if you will, that we can cut rates quicker, we can cut rates faster. A, that's not how that works.
Yeah, they seem to be competing agendas
It's not how the Fed policy is implemented. It's point blank. So the big question is, how long does this saga, if you will, play on, and how does that ultimately impact the path forward for the Fed?
Bailey, last question. I promised I would get to it the last time that you were on here, and that is the degree to which private credit is really roiling and weighing on a lot of investors' minds going forward here. What are you going to be watching for in the week ahead as an indication of how big a weight that is?
Do we see more potential loans being written down to zero is the big thing top of mind? And do we see kind of these funds and firms rethinking redemption levels if we do continue to see those go from 5 and 7% to higher, and then B, just how the entire financial market is trading from an equity perspective. We've seen the KBW Bank Index under tremendous pressure. We've seen really jaw-dropping sell-offs. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, obviously Blue Owl's top of mind, KKR. If we see continued weakness from the equity perspective, what does that indicate? What does that imply for these actual parent companies as well as some of these BDCs?
All right, Bailey Lifschultz, Michael McKay, thank you both so much. I feel slightly smarter now. Tune in Wednesday beginning at 1:30 p.m. for special live coverage of the Fed's decision.
Yes, Michael McKay will be there alongside Tom Keene and Jonathan Farrow for that conversation starting at 2 when that decision comes out. And of course, going through the press conference where Michael McKay will be front and center, as he always is. We look forward to his question and the response from the Fed chair to it. All right, billions will be spent on sports gambling this week alone, with March Madness getting underway, as we were talking about. Selection Sunday is today. So what happens when you give $10,000, 10,000 simoleons to someone who does not gamble? That is when McKay Coppins of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, saw fit, editor-in-chief of that magazine, to give that sum of money to McKay. I would like to have been in the room for that conversation. If my bosses are listening, I think I would also like $10,000 to try this out, sports betting. There is all kinds of wonderful nuance to this, but McKay took that money, deployed it across both betting markets, went to Vegas. It's an incredible story. We're going to get into that with him in just a moment. When we come back on Bloomberg This Weekend, which of course is live on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and online.
Stick with us. Forget the Ides of March, like we've been talking about. Today is Selection Sunday, and if you don't have your brackets ready, your time is running out. But what if this friendly bet between coworkers goes against your beliefs?
McKay Coppins is back with us now. He is the cover story of this week's Atlantic. It is My Year as a Degenerate Gambler, and as we said just a moment ago, Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of that magazine, gave McKay Coppins, who is Mormon, I should say that is a crucial part of this story, yes. Gambling against the beliefs of Mormons, $10,000 to play in the betting markets, which of course have become so big in this country. Last year, $4.9 billion, I believe, spent on gambling going for it. McKay, it's a fascinating piece, a wonderful ride over the last year, and something that you wrote stood out to me. You said there's something unsettling about the suddenness with which gambling becomes omnipresent in American sports. And as the dad of 3 kids who watches a lot of sports, this is so evident. How many advertisements are about this? How much of the programming surrounding basketball and baseball and football games is now totally driven toward what the odds of X, Y, and Z are?
Yeah, that was actually my first kind of encounter with gambling, right? As you said, I'm a Mormon. I don't gamble, but I'm a sports fan, and I watch sports with my 10-year-old son. And you turn on any game on any channel at any time of the day, and you will be bombarded with these kind of neon-soaked, star-studded advertisements for online sports books. It is everywhere. The pre-game panels talk about the betting odds. ESPN covers the betting odds. It's become kind of the running narrative theme of American sports, and it happened almost overnight, right? 10 years ago, sports betting was illegal in most of the country. And while, of course, some people were gambling on sports, you typically had to go to a place like Las Vegas to do it. And now that it's on everybody's phone, it really has become kind of omnipresent in the culture in a way that I think a lot of people find pretty startling.
Okay, I want to ask all the stupid questions. How did you come up with this idea? Can you talk us through this meeting with Jeffrey Goldberg, who we both know, and I can't even picture his face. And then how did you get permission to do this? I'm assuming you had to go to your bishop or someone in the church to okay this. And what was that like?
Yeah, well, it's funny because this started as a more normal magazine assignment, right? The idea was we want a big, juicy feature about the rise of the sports betting industry in America. And when I was talking to my editor about it, we were kind of going through the regular ideas of how to report this out. I would talk to executives at FanDuel and DraftKings. I would talk to people who struggle with gambling addiction. And then I think it was actually my editor who came up with this idea. He said, it would be good if you had a little skin in the game. You should experience this phenomenon.
So it's Jeffrey's idea.
It was not. It was actually my editor. But what's funny is that my editor came up with the idea of like, oh, maybe we'll give you a few $100. I'm pretty sure it was Jeff's idea to give me $10,000. And you know Jeff, I mean, I think he kind of reveled in the idea of putting one of his riders in like an uncomfortable
100%.
Seeing what would happen. I did go to my bishop to run the idea by him, and I had a very kind of uncomfortable meeting with him where I could see the kind of look of pastoral concern bloom across his face as I explained the experiment. But he tentatively said, you know, I think that if it's really just for journalism, then it's fine. But the last thing he said to me in that meeting was, be careful. And I kind of shrugged it off in the moment. And it turns out that was prophetic on his point.
Yeah, McKay, so I want to go there because you said be careful. And that was the thing that stuck out to me. As you're reading the article, you're finding you kind of slip more and more into this whole addiction cycle and how your family responded to it and started noticing. I mean, believe it was your daughter or your son who was like, Dad's in the pantry again doing that thing. He's looking at the phone. You know, talk about how your family kind of took on all this as well, because they're going down the road with you too.
Yeah, you know, I started by trying to hide it from my kids. I have 4 kids. Most of them are quite young. And I didn't want them to know that their dad was gambling, even if it was just for work. Quickly, they figured it out. And I was surprised by how quickly this experiment kind of bled into my personal life, right? Like, as you mentioned, I was within a few weeks hiding in the pantry or the bathroom to put bets in. I was routinely staying up past midnight to watch the games I was gambling on, and then to spend more time kind of in my darkened bedroom scrolling through DraftKings for more bets. It is incredibly compulsive. And I think that should be understated. You know, when you talk to experts on this, they'll say that only 2 to 5% of people will develop genuine gambling addiction. And, you know, what advocates for addicts will say is, yes, but now that we're creating tens of millions of new gamblers in America, that number actually is really alarming. But even if you don't become a full-blown gambling addict, which I don't think that I check all the boxes, I still was definitely using these apps compulsively. It was definitely robbing me of time and experiences with my family. Around Christmas time, I write in the piece about how I went on tilt, is a term gamblers use, which I was chasing my losses. I was making bigger and bigger bets, making really reckless bets. And it really was kind of taking over my life in a way that I was not prepared for.
McKay Coppins, thank you very much. It's a great piece. Again, the title, My Year as a Degenerate Gambler, and his mentor consigliere in this was Nate Silver, the famous pollster who is a big poker player. And there's a line that stood out to me from what he said to you early on. If you make 1 penny, that would be better than 98% of people over an entire season. So just a sober framing of how people are playing this and that they actually win. The house does indeed always win. McKay, thank you very much for your perspective.
Thanks, McKay. That was great.
On politics and for the piece as well.
It's so fascinating to me. I don't have the gambling bug. I just have never understood it. But I have watched other people, even in casual situations, get so swept up in it. It can be really dangerous.
I mean, my husband, he stresses from fantasy football. Nevertheless, do something like this. But my son gets into it. So you have like the young 20s, or even sometimes you get those like 18-year-olds because of calcium polymarket. You can be 18 and do it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. Join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. We'll be back with you Saturday at 7 o'clock Wall Street time for our audience on Bloomberg TV. The Mishal Hussein Show starts right now.